Chapter 31 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 31. The Sea Monster. Wednesday, August 19th. Fortunately, the wind, which for the present blows with some violence, has allowed us to escape from the scene of the unparalleled and extraordinary struggle. Hans, with his usual imperturbable calm, remained at the helm. My uncle, who for a short time had been withdrawn from his absorbing reveries by the novel incidents of the sea fight, fell back again apparently into a brown study. His eyes were fixed impatiently on the widespread ocean. Our voyage now became monotonous and uniform. Dull as it has become, I have no desire to have it broken by any repetition of the perils and adventures of yesterday. Thursday, August the 20th. The wind is now north-northeast, and blows very irregularly. It has changed to fitful gusts. The temperature is exceedingly high. We are now progressing at the average rate of about 10 miles and a half per hour. About 12 o'clock a distant sound as of thunder fell upon our ears. I make a note of the fact without even venturing a suggestion as to its cause. It was one continued roar as of a sea falling over mighty rocks. "Far off in the distance," said the Professor dogmatically, "there is some rock or some island against which the sea, lashed to fury by the wind, is breaking violently." Hans, without saying a word, clambered to the top of the mast, but could make out nothing. The ocean was level in every direction as far as the eye could reach. 3 hours passed away without any sign to indicate what might be before us. The sound began to assume that of a mighty cataract. I expressed my opinion on this point strongly to my uncle. He merely shook his head. I, however, am strongly impressed by a conviction that I am not wrong. Are we advancing towards some mighty waterfall which shall cast us into the abyss? Probably this mode of descending into the abyss may be agreeable to the Professor, because it would be something like the vertical descent he is so eager to make. I entertain a very different opinion. Whatever be the truth, it is certain that not many leagues distant there must be some very extraordinary phenomenon, for as we advance the roar becomes something mighty and stupendous. Is it in the water or in the air? I cast hasty glances aloft at the suspended vapors, and I seek to penetrate their mighty depths. But the vault above is tranquil. The clouds, which are now elevated to the very summit, appear utterly still and motionless, and completely lost in the irradiation of electric light. It is necessary, therefore, to seek for the cause of this phenomenon elsewhere. I examine the horizon, now perfectly calm, pure, and free from all haze. Its aspect still remains unchanged. But if this awful noise proceeds from a cataract, if, so to speak in plain English, this vast interior ocean is precipitated into a lower basin, if these tremendous roars are produced by the noise of falling waters, the current would increase in activity, and its increasing swiftness would give me some idea of the extent of the peril with which we are menaced. I consult the current. It simply does not exist. There is no such thing. An empty bottle cast into the water lies to leeward without motion. About 4 o'clock, Hans rises, clambers up the mast, and reaches the truck itself. From this elevated position his looks are cast around. They take in a vast circumference of the ocean. At last his eyes remain fixed. His face expresses no astonishment, but his eyes slightly dilate. "He has seen something at last," cried my uncle. "I think so," I replied. Hans came down, stood beside us, and pointed with his right hand to the south. "Där nere," he said. "There," replied my uncle. And seizing his telescope, he looked at it with great attention for about a minute, which to me appeared an age. I knew not what to think or expect. "Yes, yes," he cried in a tone of considerable surprise. "There it is." "What?" I asked. "A tremendous spurt of water rising out of the waves." "Some other marine monster?" I cried, already alarmed. "Perhaps." "Then let us steer more to the westward, for we know what we have to expect from antediluvian animals," was my eager reply. "Go ahead," said my uncle. I turned towards Hans. Hans was at the tiller, steering with his usual imperturbable calm. Nevertheless, from the distance which separated us from this creature, a distance which must be estimated at no less than a dozen leagues, one could see the column of water spurting from the blow hole of the great animal. His dimensions must be something preternatural. To fly is, therefore, the course to be suggested by ordinary prudence. But we have not come into that part of the world to be prudent. Such is my uncle's determination. We accordingly continued to advance. The nearer we come, the loftier is the spouting water. What monster can fill himself with such huge volumes of water, and then unceasingly spout them out in such lofty jets? At 8 o'clock in the evening, reckoning as above ground, where there is day and night, we are not more than 2 leagues from the mighty beast. Its long, black, enormous, mountainous body lies on the top of the water, like an island. But then sailors have been said to have gone ashore on sleeping whales, mistaking them for land. Is it illusion, or is it fear? Its length cannot be less than 1,000 fathoms. What, then, is this Cretaceous monster of which no Cuvier ever thought? It is quite motionless and presents the appearance of sleep. The sea seems unable to lift him upwards. It is rather the waves which break on his huge and gigantic frame. The waterspout, rising to a height of 500 feet, breaks in spray with a dull, sullen roar. We advance like senseless lunatics towards this mighty mass. I honestly confess that I was abjectly afraid. I declared that I would go no farther. I threatened in my terror to cut the sheet of the sail. I attacked the Professor with considerable acrimony, calling him foolhardy, mad, I know not what. He made no answer. Suddenly the imperturbable Hans once more pointed his finger to the menacing object. "Holme." "An island!" cried my uncle. "An island!" I replied, shrugging my shoulders at this poor attempt at deception. "Of course it is!" cried my uncle, bursting into a loud and joyous laugh. "But the waterspout " "Geyser," said Hans. "Yes, of course, a geyser," replied my uncle, still laughing. "A geyser like those common in Iceland. Jets like this are the great wonders of the country." At first I would not allow that I had been so grossly deceived. What could be more ridiculous than to have taken an island for a marine monster? But kick as one may, one must yield to evidence, and I was finally convinced of my error. It was nothing, after all, but a natural phenomenon. As we approached nearer and nearer, the dimensions of the liquid sheaf of waters became truly grand and stupendous. The island had at a distance presented the appearance of an enormous whale, whose head rose high above the waters. The geyser, a word the Icelanders pronounce geysir, and which signifies fury, rose majestically from its summit. Dull detonations are heard every now and then, and the enormous jet, taken as it were with sudden fury, shakes its plume of vapor, and bounds into the first layer of the clouds. It is alone, neither spurts of vapor nor hot springs surround it, and the whole volcanic power of that region is concentrated in one sublime column. The rays of electric light mix with this dazzling sheaf, every drop as it falls assuming the prismatic colors of the rainbow. "Let us go on shore," said the Professor after some minutes of silence. It is necessary, however, to take great precaution in order to avoid the weight of falling waters, which would cause the raft to founder in an instant. Hans, however, steers admirably, and brings us to the other extremity of the island. I was the first to leap on the rock. My uncle followed, while the eider duck hunter remained still like a man above any childish sources of astonishment. We were now walking on granite mixed with silicious sandstone. The soil shivered under our feet like the sides of boilers in which overheated steam is forcibly confined. It is burning. We soon came in sight of the little central basin from which rose the geyser. I plunged a thermometer into the water, which ran bubbling from the center, and it marked a heat of 163 degrees. This water, therefore, came from some place where the heat was intense. This was singularly in contradiction with the theories of Professor Hartwig. I could not help telling him my opinion on the subject. "Well," said he sharply, "and what does this prove against my doctrine?" "Nothing," replied I dryly, seeing that I was running my head against a foregone conclusion. Nevertheless, I am compelled to confess that until now we had been most remarkably fortunate, and that this voyage is being accomplished in most favorable conditions of temperature. But it appears evident, in fact certain, that we shall sooner or later arrive at one of those regions where the central heat will reach its utmost limits, and will go far beyond all the possible gradations of thermometers. Visions of the Hades of the ancients, believed to be in the center of the earth, floated through my imagination. We shall, however, see what we shall see. That is the Professor's favorite phrase now. Having christened the volcanic island by the name of his nephew, the leader of the expedition turned away and gave the signal for embarkation. I stood still, however, for some minutes gazing upon the magnificent geyser. I soon was able to perceive that the upward tendency of the water was irregular. Now it diminished in intensity, and then suddenly it regained new vigor, which I attributed to the variation of the pressure of the accumulated vapors in its reservoir. At last we took our departure, going carefully round the projecting and rather dangerous rocks of the southern side. Hans had taken advantage of this brief halt to repair the raft. Before we took our final departure from the island, however, I made some observations to calculate the distance we had gone over, and I put them down in my journal. Since we left Port Gretchen, we had traveled 270 leagues, more than 800 miles, on this great inland sea. We were therefore 620 leagues from Iceland, and exactly under England. End of chapter 31. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 32 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 32. The Battle of the Elements. Friday, August 21st. This morning the magnificent geyser had wholly disappeared. The wind had freshened up, and we were fast leaving the neighborhood of Henry's Island. Even the roaring sound of the mighty column was lost to the ear. The weather, if under the circumstances we may use such an expression, is about to change very suddenly. The atmosphere is being gradually loaded with vapors. which carry with them the electricity formed by the constant evaporation of the saline waters. The clouds are slowly but sensibly falling towards the sea, and are assuming a dark olive texture. The electric rays can scarcely pierce through the opaque curtain which has fallen like a drop seen before this wondrous theater, on the stage of which another and terrible drama is soon to be enacted. This time it is no fight of animals. It is the fearful battle of the elements. I feel that I am very peculiarly influenced, as all creatures are on land when a deluge is about to take place. The cumuli, a perfectly oval kind of cloud, piled upon the south, presented a most awful and sinister appearance, with the pitiless aspect often seen before a storm. The air is extremely heavy, the sea is comparatively calm. In the distance the clouds have assumed the appearance of enormous balls of cotton, or rather pods, piled one above the other in picturesque confusion. By degrees they appear to swell out, break, and gain in number what they lose in grandeur. Their heaviness is so great that they are unable to lift themselves from the horizon. But under the influence of the upper currents of air, they are gradually broken up, become much darker, and then present the appearance of one single layer of a formidable character. Now and then a lighter cloud, still lit up from above, rebounds upon this gray carpet, and is lost in the opaque mass. There can be no doubt that the entire atmosphere is saturated with electric fluid. I myself wholly impregnated, my hairs literally stand on end, as if under the influence of a galvanic battery. If one of my companions ventured to touch me, I think he would receive rather a violent and unpleasant shock. About 10 o'clock in the morning the symptoms of the storm became more thorough and decisive. The wind appeared to soften down as if to take breath for a renewed attack. The vast funeral pall above us looked like a huge bag, like the cave of Aeolus, in which the storm was collecting its forces for the attack. I tried all I could not to believe in the menacing signs of the sky, and yet I could not avoid saying, as it were involuntarily, "I believe we are going to have bad weather." The Professor made me no answer. He was in a horrible, in a detestable humor to see the ocean stretching interminably before his eyes. On hearing my words, he simply shrugged his shoulders. "We shall have a tremendous storm," I said again, pointing to the horizon. "These clouds are falling lower and lower upon the sea as if to crush it." A great silence prevailed. The wind wholly ceased. Nature assumed a dead calm, and ceased to breathe. Upon the mast, where I noticed a sort of slight ignis fatuus, the sail hangs in loose heavy folds. The raft is motionless in the midst of a dark heavy sea, without undulation, without motion. It is as still as glass. But as we are making no progress, what is the use of keeping up the sail, which may be the cause of our perdition, if the tempest should suddenly strike us without warning? "Let us lower the sail," I said. "It is only an act of common prudence." "No, no," cried my uncle in an exasperated tone. "100 times no. Let the wind strike us and do its worst. Let the storm sweep us away where it will. Only let me see the glimmer of some coast, of some rocky cliffs, even if they dash our raft into 1,000 pieces. No, keep up the sail, no matter what happens." These words were scarcely uttered when the southern horizon underwent a sudden and violent change. The long accumulated vapors were resolved into water, and the air required to fill up the void produced became a wild and raging tempest. It came from the most distant corners of the mighty cavern. It raged from every point of the compass. It roared, it yelled, it shrieked with glee as of demons let loose. The darkness increased and became indeed darkness visible. The raft rose and fell with the storm, and bounded over the waves. My uncle was cast headlong upon the deck. I with great difficulty dragged myself towards him. He was holding on with might and main to the end of a cable, and appeared to gaze with pleasure and delight at the spectacle of the unchained elements. Hans never moved a muscle. His long hair, driven hither and thither by the tempest and scattered wildly over his motionless face, gave him a most extraordinary appearance, for every single hair was illuminated by little sparkling sprigs. His countenance presents the extraordinary appearance of an antediluvian man, a true contemporary of the megatherium. Still the mast holds good against the storm. The sail spreads out and feels like a soap bubble about to burst. The raft rushes on at a pace impossible to estimate, but still less swiftly than the body of water displaced beneath it, the rapidity of which may be seen by the lines which fly right and left in the wake. "The sail! The sail!" I cried, making a trumpet of my hands, and then endeavoring to lower it. "Let it alone," said my uncle, more exasperated than ever. "Nay," said Hans, gently shaking his head. Nevertheless, the rain formed a roaring cataract before this horizon of which we were in search, and to which we were rushing like madmen. But before this wilderness of waters reached us, the mighty veil of cloud was torn in twain. The sea began to foam wildly, and the electricity produced by some vast and extraordinary chemical action in the upper layer of cloud is brought into play. To the fearful claps of thunder are added dazzling flashes of lightning, such as I had never seen. The flashes crossed one another, hurled from every side, while the thunder came pealing like an echo. The mass of vapor becomes incandescent. The hailstones which strike the metal of our boots and our weapons are actually luminous. The waves as they rise appear to be fire-eating monsters, beneath which seethes an intense fire, their crests surmounted by combs of flame. My eyes are dazzled, blinded by the intensity of light. My ears are deafened by the awful roar of the elements. I am compelled to hold on to the mast, which bends like a reed beneath the violence of the storm, to which none ever before seen by mariners bore any resemblance. Here my traveling notes become very incomplete, loose, and vague. I have only been able to make out one or two fugitive observations, jotted down in a mere mechanical way. But even their brevity, even their obscurity show the emotions which overcame me. Sunday, August 23rd. Where have we got to? In what region are we wandering? We are still carried forward with inconceivable rapidity. The night has been fearful, something not to be described. The storm shows no signs of cessation. We exist in the midst of an uproar which has no name. The detonations as of artillery are incessant. Our ears literally bleed. We are unable to exchange a word or hear each other speak. The lightning never ceases to flash for a single instant. I can see the zigzags after a rapid dart strike the arched roof of this mightiest of mighty vaults. If it were to give way and fall upon us! Other lightnings plunge their forked streaks in every direction, and take the form of globes of fire which explode like bombshells over a beleaguered city. The general crash and roar do not apparently increase. It has already gone far beyond what human ear can appreciate. If all the powder magazines in the world were to explode together, it would be impossible for us to hear worse noise. There is a constant emission of light from the storm clouds. The electric matter is incessantly released. Evidently, the gaseous principles of the air are out of order. Innumerable columns of water rush up like waterspouts and fall back upon the surface of the ocean in foam. Whither are we going? My uncle still lies at full length upon the raft, without speaking, without taking any note of time. The heat increases. I look at the thermometer. To my surprise, it indicates. The exact figure is here rubbed out in my manuscript. Monday, August 24th. This terrible storm will never end. Why should not this state of the atmosphere, so dense and murky, once modified, again remain definitive? We are utterly broken and harassed by fatigue. Hans remains just as usual. The raft runs to the southeast invariably. We have now already run 200 leagues from the newly discovered island. About 12 o'clock the storm became worse than ever. We are obliged now to fasten every bit of cargo tightly on the deck of the raft, or everything would be swept away. We make ourselves fast too, each man lashing the other. The waves drive over us, so that several times we are actually under water. We had been under the painful necessity of abstaining from speech for 3 days and 3 nights. We opened our mouths, we moved our lips, but no sound came. Even when we placed our mouths to each other's ears, it was the same. The wind carried the voice away. My uncle once contrived to get his head close to mine after several almost vain endeavors. He appeared to my nearly exhausted senses to articulate some word. I had a notion, more from intuition than anything else, that he said to me, "We are lost." I took out my notebook, from which under the most desperate circumstances I never parted, and wrote a few words, as legibly as I could. "Take in sail." With a deep sigh he nodded his head and acquiesced. His head had scarcely time to fall back in the position from which he had momentarily raised it, than a disk or ball of fire appeared on the very edge of the raft. Our devoted, our doomed craft! The mast and sail are carried away bodily, and I see them swept away to a prodigious height like a kite. We were frozen, actually shivered with terror. The ball of fire, half white, half azure colored, about the size of a 10-inch bombshell, moved along, turning with prodigious rapidity to leeward of the storm. It ran about here, there, and everywhere. It clambered up one of the bulwarks of the raft. It leaped upon the sack of provisions, and then finally descended lightly, fell like a football, and landed on our powder barrel. Horrible situation! An explosion, of course, was now inevitable. By Heaven's mercy, it was not so. The dazzling disk moved on one side. It approached Hans, who looked at it with singular fixity. Then it approached my uncle, who cast himself on his knees to avoid it. It came towards me as I stood pale and shuddering in the dazzling light and heat. It pirouetted round my feet, which I endeavored to withdraw. An odor of nitrous gas filled the whole air. It penetrated to the throat, to the lungs. I felt ready to choke. Why is it that I cannot withdraw my feet? Are they riveted to the flooring of the raft? No. The fall of the electric globe has turned all the iron on board into loadstones. The instruments, the tools, the arms are clanging together with awful and horrible noise. The nails of my heavy boots adhere closely to the plate of iron incrustated in the wood. I cannot withdraw my foot. It is the old story again of the mountain of adamant. At last, by a violent and almost superhuman effort, I tear it away, just as the ball, which is still executing its gyratory motions, is about to run round it and drag me with it if... Oh, what intense, stupendous light! The globe of fire bursts. We are enveloped in cascades of living fire, which flood the space around with luminous matter. Then all went out, and darkness once more fell upon the deep. I had just time to see my uncle once more cast apparently senseless on the flooring of the raft, Hans at the helm spitting fire under the influence of the electricity which seemed to have gone through him. "Whither are we going?" I ask, and echo answers, "Whither?" Thursday, August 25th. I have just come out of a long fainting fit. The awful and hideous storm still continues. The lightning has increased in vividness, and pours out its fiery wrath like a brood of serpents let loose in the atmosphere. Are we still upon the sea? Yes, and being carried along with incredible velocity. We have passed under England, under the Channel, under France, probably under the whole extent of Europe. Another awful clamor in the distance. This time it is certain that the sea is breaking upon the rocks at no great distance. Then End of chapter 32. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 33 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 33. Our Route Reversed. Here ends what I call my journal of our voyage on board the raft, which journal was happily saved from the wreck. I proceed with my narrative as I did before I commenced my daily notes. What happened when the terrible shock took place, when the raft was cast upon the rocky shore, it would be impossible for me now to say. I felt myself precipitated violently into the boiling waves, and if I escaped from a certain and cruel death, it was wholly owing to the determination of the faithful Hans, who, clutching me by the arm, saved me from the yawning abyss. The courageous Icelander then carried me in his powerful arms far out of the reach of the waves, and laid me down upon a burning expanse of sand, where I found myself some time afterwards in the company of my uncle the Professor. Then he quietly returned towards the fatal rocks, against which the furious waves were beating, in order to save any stray waifs from the wreck. This man was always practical and thoughtful. I could not utter a word. I was quite overcome with emotion. My whole body was broken and bruised with fatigue. It took hours before I was anything like myself. Meanwhile, there fell a fearful deluge of rain, drenching us to the skin. Its very violence, however, proclaimed the approaching end of the storm. Some overhanging rocks afforded us a slight protection from the torrents. Under this shelter, Hans prepared some food, which, however, I was unable to touch, and, exhausted by the 3 weary days and nights of watching, we fell into a deep and painful sleep. My dreams were fearful, but at last exhausted nature asserted her supremacy, and I slumbered. Next day, when I awoke, the change was magical. The weather was magnificent. Air and sea, as if by mutual consent, had regained their serenity. Every trace of the storm, even the faintest, had disappeared. I was saluted on my awakening by the first joyous tones I had heard from the Professor for many a day. His gaiety, indeed, was something terrible. "Well, my lad," he cried, rubbing his hands together, "have you slept soundly?" Might it not have been supposed that we were in the old house on the Königstrasse, that I had just come down quietly to my breakfast, and that my marriage with Gretchen was to take place that very day? My uncle's coolness was exasperating. Alas, considering how the tempest had driven us in an easterly direction, we had passed under the whole of Germany, under the city of Hamburg, where I had been so happy, under the very street which contained all I loved and cared for in the world. It was a positive fact that I was only separated from her by a distance of 40 leagues, but these 40 leagues were of hard, impenetrable granite. All these dreary and miserable reflections passed through my mind before I attempted to answer my uncle's question.
"Why, what is the matter?" he cried. "Cannot you say whether you have slept well or not?"
I have slept very well, was my reply, but every bone in my body aches. I suppose that will lead to nothing.
Nothing at all, my boy. It is only the result of the fatigue of the last few days, that is all.
You appear, if I may be allowed to say so, to be very jolly this morning, I said.
Delighted, my dear boy, delighted. Was never happier in my life. We have at last reached the wished for port.
The end of our expedition? Cried I, in a tone of considerable surprise.
No, but to the confines of that sea which I began to fear would never end, but go round the whole world. We will now tranquilly resume our journey by land, and once again endeavor to dive into the center of the earth. My dear uncle, I began in a hesitating kind of way, allow me to ask you one question. Certainly, Harry, a dozen if you think proper.
One will suffice. How about getting back? I asked.
How about getting back? What a question to ask! We have as not yet reached the end of our journey.
I know that. All I want to know is how you propose we shall manage the return voyage.
In the most simple manner in the world, said the imperturbable professor. Once we reach the exact center of this sphere, either we shall find a new road by which to ascend to the surface, or we shall simply turn round and go back by the way we came. I have every reason to believe that while we are traveling forward, it will not close behind us.
Then one of the first matters to see to will be to repair the raft, was my rather melancholy response.
Of course, we must attend to that above all things, continued the professor.
Then comes the all important question of provisions, I urged. Have we anything like enough left to enable us to accomplish such great, such amazing designs as you contemplate carrying out?
I have seen into the matter, and my answer is in the affirmative. Hans is a very clever fellow, and I have reason to believe that he has saved the greater part of the cargo. But the best way to satisfy your scruples is to come and judge for yourself.
Saying which he led the way out of the kind of open grotto in which we had taken shelter. I had almost begun to hope that which I should rather have feared, and this was the impossibility of such a shipwreck leaving even the slightest signs of what it had carried as freight. I was, however, thoroughly mistaken. As soon as I reached the shores of this inland sea, I found Hans standing gravely in the midst of a large number of things, laid out in complete order. My uncle wrung his hands with deep and silent gratitude. His heart was too full for speech. This man, whose superhuman devotion to his employers I not only never saw surpassed, nor even equaled, had been hard at work all the time we slept, and at the risk of his life had succeeded in saving the most precious articles of our cargo. Of course, under the circumstances, we necessarily experienced several severe losses. Our weapons had wholly vanished, but experience had taught us to do without them. The provision of powder had, however, remained intact, after having narrowly escaped blowing us all to atoms in the storm.
Well, said the professor, who was now ready to make the best of everything, as we have no guns, all we have to do is to give up all idea of hunting.
Yes, my dear sir, we can do without them, but what about all our instruments?
Here is the manometer, the most useful of all, and which I gladly accept in lieu of the rest. With it alone I can calculate the depth as we proceed. By its means alone I shall be able to decide when we have reached the center of the earth. Ha! But for this little instrument, we might make a mistake, and run the risk of coming out at the antipodes."
All this was said amid bursts of unnatural laughter. "But the compass!" I cried. "Without that, what can we do?"
"Here it is, safe and sound," he cried with real joy. "Ah, ha, ha! And here we have the chronometer and the thermometers. Hans, the hunter, is indeed an invaluable man."
It was impossible to deny this fact. As far as the nautical and other instruments were concerned, nothing was wanting. Then, on further examination, I found ladders, cords, pickaxes, crowbars, and shovels, all scattered about on the shore. There was, however, finally the most important question of all, and that was provisions. "But what are we to do for food?" I asked.
"Let us see to the commissariat department," replied my uncle gravely.
The boxes which contained our supply of food for the voyage were placed in a row along the strand, and were in a capital state of preservation. The sea had in every case respected their contents, and, to sum up in one sentence, taking into consideration biscuits, salt, meat, Schiedam, and dried fish, we could still calculate on having about 4 months' supply if used with prudence and caution.
4 months!" cried the sanguine Professor in high glee. "Then we shall have plenty of time both to go and come. And with what remains I undertake to give a grand dinner to my colleagues of the Johanneum."
I sighed. I should by this time have become used to the temperament of my uncle, and yet this man astonished me more and more every day. He was the greatest human enigma I ever had known.
"Now," he said, "before we do anything else, we must lay in a stock of fresh water. The rain has fallen in abundance and filled the hollows of the granite. There is a rich supply of water, and we have no fear of suffering from thirst, which in our circumstances is of the last importance. As for the raft, I shall recommend Hans to repair it to the best of his abilities, though I have every reason to believe we shall not require it again."
"How is that?" I cried, more amazed than ever at my uncle's style of reasoning.
"I have an idea, my dear boy. It is none other than this simple fact: we shall not come out by the same opening as that by which we entered." I began to look at my uncle with vague suspicion. An idea had more than once taken possession of me, and this was that he was going mad. And yet, little did I think how true and prophetic his words were doomed to be. "And now," he
said,
"having seen to all these matters of detail, to breakfast."
I followed him to a sort of projecting cape, after he had given his last instructions to our guide. In this original position, with dried meat, biscuit, and a delicious cup of tea, we made a satisfactory meal. I may say one of the most welcome and pleasant I ever remember. Exhaustion, the keen atmosphere, the state of calm after so much agitation, all contributed to give me an excellent appetite. Indeed, it contributed very much to producing a pleasant and cheerful state of mind. While breakfast was in hand, and between the sips of warm tea, I asked my uncle if he had any idea of how we now stood in relation to the world above. "For my part," I added, "I think it will be rather difficult to determine."
"Well, if we were compelled to fix the exact spot," said my uncle, "it might be difficult, since during the 3 days of that awful tempest I could keep no account either of the quickness of our pace, or of the direction in which the raft was going. Still we will endeavor to approximate to the truth. We shall not, I believe, be so very far out."
"Well, if I recollect rightly," I replied, "our last observation was made at the Geyser Island."
"Harry's Island, my boy, Harry's Island. Do not decline the honor of having named it. Given your name to an island discovered by us, the first human beings who trod it since the creation of the world."
"Let it be so, then. At Harry's Island we had already gone over 270 leagues of sea, and we were, I believe about 600 leagues more or less from Iceland."
Good. I am glad to see that you remember so well. Let us start from that point, and let us count 4 days of storm during which our rate of traveling must have been very great. I should say that our velocity must have been about 80 leagues to the 24 hours.
I agreed that I thought this a fair calculation. There were then 300 leagues to be added to the grand total.
Yes, and the Central Sea must extend at least 600 leagues from side to side. Do you know, my boy, Harry, that we have discovered an inland lake larger than the Mediterranean?
Certainly, and we only know of its extent in one way. It may be hundreds of miles in length.
Very likely.
Then, said I, after calculating for some minutes, if your previsions are right, we are at this moment exactly under the Mediterranean itself.
Do you think so?
Yes, I'm almost certain of it. Are we not 900 leagues distant from Reykjavik?
That is perfectly true, and a famous bit of road we have traveled, my boy. But why we should be under the Mediterranean more than under Turkey or the Atlantic Ocean can only be known when we are sure of not having deviated from our course, and of this we know nothing.
I do not think we were driven very far from our course. The wind appears to me to have been always about the same. My opinion is that this shore must be situated to the southeast of Port Gretchen.
Good, I hope so. It will, however, be easy to decide the matter by taking the bearings from our departure by means of the compass. Come along, and we will consult that invaluable invention.
The Professor now walked eagerly in the direction of the rock where the indefatigable Hans had placed the instruments in safety. My uncle was gay and light-hearted. He rubbed his hands and assumed all sorts of attitudes. He was to all appearance once more a young man. Since I had known him, never had he been so amiable and pleasant. I followed him, rather curious to know whether I had made any mistake in my estimation of our position. As soon as we had reached the rock, my uncle took the compass, placed it horizontally before him, and looked keenly at the needle. As he had at first shaken it to give it vivacity, it oscillated considerably, and then slowly assumed its right position under the influence of the magnetic power. The Professor bent his eyes curiously over the wondrous instrument. A violent start immediately showed the extent of his emotion. He closed his eyes, rubbed them, and took another and a keener survey. Then he turned slowly round to me, stupefaction depicted on his countenance. "What is the matter?" said I, beginning to be alarmed. He could not speak. He was too overwhelmed for words. He simply pointed to the instrument. I examined it eagerly, according to his mute directions, and a loud cry of surprise escaped my lips. The needle of the compass pointed due north, in the direction we expected was the south. It pointed to the shore instead of to the high seas. I shook the compass. I examined it with a curious and anxious eye. It was in a state of perfection. No blemish in any way explained the phenomenon. Whatever position we forced the needle into, it returned invariably to the same unexpected point. It was useless attempting to conceal from ourselves the fatal truth. There could be no doubt about it, unwelcome as was the fact, that during the tempest there had been a sudden slant of wind, of which we had been unable to take any account, and thus the raft had carried us back to the shores we had left, apparently forever, so many days before. End of chapter 33. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 34 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 34. A Voyage of Discovery. It would be altogether impossible for me to give any idea of the utter astonishment which overcame the Professor on making this extraordinary discovery. Amazement, incredulity, and rage were blended in such a way as to alarm me. During the whole course of my life, I had never seen a man at first so chapfallen, and then so furiously indignant. The terrible fatigues of our sea voyage, the fearful dangers we had passed through, had all gone for nothing. We had to begin them all over again. Instead of progressing as we fondly expected during a voyage of so many days, we had retreated. Every hour of our expedition on the raft had been so much lost time. Presently, however, the indomitable energy of my uncle overcame every other consideration.
So, he said between his set teeth, fatality will play me these terrible tricks. The elements themselves conspire to overwhelm me with mortification. Air, fire, and water combine their united efforts to oppose my passage. Well, they shall see what the earnest will of a determined man can do. I will not yield. I will not retreat even 1 inch, and we shall see who shall triumph in this great contest, man or nature.
Standing upright on a rock, irritated and menacing, Professor Hardwigg, like the ferocious Ajax, seemed to defy the fates. I, however, took upon myself to interfere, and to impose some sort of check upon such insensate enthusiasm. "Listen to me, uncle," I said in a firm but temperate tone of voice. "There must be some limit to ambition here below. It is utterly useless to struggle against the impossible. Pray listen to reason. We are utterly unprepared for a sea voyage. It is simply madness to think of performing a journey of 500 leagues upon a wretched pile of beams, with a counterpane for a sail, a paltry stick for a mast, and a tempest to contend with. As we are totally incapable of steering our frail craft, we shall become the mere plaything of the storm, and it is acting the part of madmen if we, a second time, run any risk upon this dangerous and treacherous Central Sea." These are only a few of the reasons and arguments I put together, reasons and arguments which to me appeared unanswerable. I was allowed to go on without interruption for about 10 minutes. The explanation to this I soon discovered. The Professor was not even listening, and did not hear a word of all my eloquence.
To the raft, he cried in a hoarse voice, when I paused for a reply.
Such was the result of my strenuous effort to resist his iron will. I tried again, I begged and implored him, I got into a passion, but I had to deal with a will more determined than my own. I seemed to feel like the waves which fought and battled against the huge mass of granite at our feet, which had smiled grimly for so many ages at their puny efforts. Hans, meanwhile, without taking part in our discussion, had been repairing the raft. One would have supposed that he instinctively guessed at the further projects of my uncle. By means of some fragments of cordage, he had again made the raft seaworthy. While I had been speaking, he had hoisted a new mast and sail, the latter already fluttering and waving in the breeze. The worthy Professor spoke a few words to our imperturbable guide, who immediately began to put our baggage on board, and to prepare for our departure. The atmosphere was now tolerably clear and pure, and the northeast wind blew steadily and serenely. It appeared likely to last for some time. What then could I do? Could I undertake to resist the iron will of two men? It was simply impossible, if even I could have hoped for the support of Hans. This, however, was out of the question. It appeared to me that the Icelander had set aside all personal will and identity. He was a picture of abnegation. I could hope for nothing from one so infatuated with and devoted to his master. All I could do, therefore, was to swim with the stream. In a mood of stolid and sullen resignation, I was about to take my accustomed place on the raft, when my uncle placed his hand upon my shoulder.
"There is no hurry, my boy," he said. "We shall not start until tomorrow."
I looked a picture of resignation to the dire will of fate.
"Under the circumstances," he said, "I ought to neglect no precautions. As fate has cast me upon these shores, I shall not leave without having completely examined them."
In order to understand this remark, I must explain that though we had been driven back to the northern shore, we had landed at a very different spot from that which had been our starting point. Port Gretchen must, we calculated, be very much to the westward. Nothing, therefore, was more natural and reasonable than that we should reconnoitre this new shore upon which we had so unexpectedly landed. "Let us go on a journey of discovery," I cried. And leaving Hans to his important operation, we started on our expedition. The distance between the foreshore at higher water and the foot of the rocks was considerable. It would take about half an hour's walking to get from one to the other. As we trudged along, our feet crushed innumerable shells of every shape and size, once the dwelling place of animals of every period of creation. I particularly noticed some enormous shells, carapaces, turtle and tortoise species, the diameter of which exceeded 15 feet. They had in past ages belonged to those gigantic Glyptodons of the Pliocene period, of which the modern turtle is but a minute specimen. In addition, the whole soil was covered by a vast quantity of stony relics, having the appearance of flints worn by the action of the waves, and lying in successive layers, one above the other. I came to the conclusion that in past ages the sea must have covered the whole district. Upon the scattered rocks, now laying far beyond its reach, the mighty waves of ages had left evident marks of their passage. On reflection, this appeared to me partially to explain the existence of this remarkable ocean 40 leagues below the surface of the earth's crust. According to my new and perhaps fanciful theory, this liquid mass must be gradually lost in the deep bowels of the earth. I had also no doubt that this mysterious sea was fed by infiltration of the ocean above, through imperceptible fissures. Nevertheless, it was impossible not to admit that these fissures must now be nearly choked up, for if not, the cavern, or rather the immense and stupendous reservoir, would have been completely filled in a short space of time. Perhaps even this water, having to contend against the accumulated subterraneous fires of the interior of the earth, had become partially vaporized. Hence the explanation of those heavy clouds suspended over our heads, and the superabundant display of that electricity which occasioned such terrible storms in this deep and cavernous sea. This lucid explanation of the phenomena we had witnessed appeared to me quite satisfactory. However great and mighty the marvels of nature may seem to us, they are always to be explained by physical reasons. Everything is subordinate to some great law of nature. It now appeared clear that we were walking upon a kind of sedimentary soil, formed like all the soils of that period, so frequent on the surface of the globe, by the subsidence of the waters. The Professor, who was now in his element, carefully examined every rocky fissure. Let him only find an opening, and it directly became important to him to examine its depth. For a whole mile we followed the windings of the Central Sea, when suddenly an important change took place in the aspect of the soil. It seemed to have been rudely cast up, convulsionized, as it were, by a violent upheaving of the lower strata. In many places hollows here and hillocks there attested great dislocations at some other period of the terrestrial mass. We advanced with great difficulty over the broken masses of granite mixed with flint, quartz, and alluvial deposits, when a large field, more even than a field, a plain of bones, appeared suddenly before our eyes. It looked like an immense cemetery where generation after generation had mingled their mortal dust. Lofty barrows of early remains rose at intervals. They undulated away to the limits of the distant horizon, and were lost in a thick and brown fog. On that spot, some 3 square miles in extent, was accumulated the whole history of animal life. Scarcely one creature upon the comparatively modern soil of the upper and inhabited world had not there existed. Nevertheless, we were drawn forward by an all absorbing and impatient curiosity. Our feet crushed with a dry and crackling sound the remains of those prehistoric fossils, for which the museums of great cities quarrel even when they obtain only rare and curious morsels. 1,000 such naturalists as Cuvier would not have sufficed to recompose the skeletons of the organic beings which lay in this magnificent osseous collection. I was utterly confounded. My uncle stood for some minutes with his arms raised on high towards the thick granite vault which served us for a sky. His mouth was wide open. His eyes sparkled wildly behind his spectacles, which he had fortunately saved. His head bobbed up and down, and from side to side, while his whole attitude and mien expressed unbounded astonishment. He stood in the presence of an endless, wondrous, and inexhaustible rich collection of antediluvian monsters, piled up for his own private and peculiar satisfaction. Fancy an enthusiastic lover of books carried suddenly into the very midst of the famous library of Alexandria, burned by the sacrilegious Omar, and which some miracle had restored to its pristine splendor. Such was something of the state of mind in which Uncle Hartwig was now placed. For some time he stood thus, literally aghast at the magnitude of his discovery. But it was even a greater excitement when, darting wildly over this mass of organic dust, he caught up a naked skull and addressed me in a quivering voice.
"Harry, my boy, Harry, this is a human head."
"A human head, uncle?" I said, no less amazed and stupefied than himself.
"Yes, nephew. Ah, Mr. Milne Edwards. Ah, Mr. de Quatrefages. Why are you not here where I am? I, Professor Hartwig."
End of chapter 34. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 35 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 35. Discovery upon Discovery. In order to fully understand the exclamation made by my uncle and his allusions to these illustrious and learned men, it will be necessary to enter into certain explanations in regard to a circumstance of the highest importance to paleontology, or the science of fossil life, which had taken place a short time before our departure from the upper regions of the earth. On the 28th of March, 1863, some navigators under the direction of M. Boucher de Perthes were at work in the great quarries of Moulin-Quignon, near Abbeville, in the department of Somme, in France. While at work, they unexpectedly came upon a human jawbone buried 14 feet below the surface of the soil. It was the first fossil of the kind that had ever been brought to light of day. Near this unexpected human relic were found stone hatchets and carved flints, colored and clothed by time in one uniform brilliant tint of verdigris. The report of this extraordinary and unexpected discovery spread not only all over France, but over England and Germany. Many learned men belonging to various scientific bodies, and noteworthy among others Messrs. Milne Edwards and de Quatrefages, took the affair very much to heart, demonstrated the incontestable authenticity of the bone in question, and became, to use the phrase then recognized in England, the most ardent supporters of the jawbone question. To the eminent geologists of the United Kingdom, who looked upon the fact as certain, Messrs. Falconer, Buck, Carpenter, and others, were soon united the learned men of Germany. And among those in the first rank, the most eager, the most enthusiastic, was my worthy uncle, Professor Hartwig. The authenticity of a human fossil of the Quaternary period seemed then to be incontestably demonstrated, and even to be admitted by the most skeptical. This system or theory, call it what you will, had, it is true, a bitter adversary in Monsieur Elie de Beaumont. This learned man, who holds such a high place in the scientific world, holds that the soil of Moulin-Quignon does not belong to the diluvium, but to a much less ancient stratum, and, in accordance with Cuvier in this respect, he would by no means admit that the human species was contemporary with the animals of the Quaternary epoch. My worthy uncle, Professor Hartwig, in concert with the great majority of geologists, had held firm, had disputed, discussed, and finally, after considerable talking and writing, Monsieur Elie de Beaumont had been pretty well left alone in his opinions. We were familiar with all the details of this discussion, but were far from being aware then that since our departure the matter had entered upon a new phase. Other similar jawbones, though belonging to individuals of varied types and very different natures, had been found in the movable gray sands of certain grottos in France, Switzerland, and Belgium, together with arms, utensils, tools, bones of children, of men in the prime of life, and of old men. The existence of men in the Quaternary period became, therefore, more positive every day. But this was far from being all. New remains dug up from the Pliocene or Tertiary deposits had enabled the more far-seeing or audacious among learned men to assign even a far greater degree of antiquity to the human race. These remains, it is true, were not those of men, that is, were not the bones of men, but objects decidedly having served the human race, shin bones, thigh bones of fossil animals, regularly scooped out, and in fact sculptured, bearing the unmistakable signs of human handiwork. By means of these wondrous and unexpected discoveries, man ascended endless centuries in the scale of time. He, in fact, preceded the mastodon, became the contemporary of the Elephas meridionalis, the southern elephant, acquired an antiquity of over 100,000 years, since that is the date given by the most eminent geologists to the Pliocene period of the earth. Such was then the state of paleontologic science, and what we moreover knew sufficed to explain our attitude before this great cemetery of the plains of the Hartwig Ocean. It will now be easy to understand the Professor's mingled astonishment and joy when, on advancing about 20 yards, he found himself in the presence of, I may say, face to face with a specimen of the human race actually belonging to the Quaternary period. It was indeed a human skull, perfectly recognizable. Had a soil of very peculiar nature, like that of the cemetery of St. Michael at Bordeaux, preserved it during countless ages? This was the question I asked myself, but which I was fully unable to answer. But this head with stretched and parchmenty skin, with the teeth whole, the hair abundant, was before our eyes as in life. I stood mute, almost paralyzed with wonder and awe before this dread apparition of another age. My uncle, who on almost every occasion was a great talker, remained for a time completely dumbfounded. He was too full of emotion for speech to be possible. After a while, however, we raised up the body to which the skull belonged. We stood it on end. It seemed to our excited imaginations to look at us with its terrible hollow eyes. After some minutes of silence, the man was vanquished by the Professor. Human instincts succumbed to scientific pride and exultation. Professor Hardwigg, carried away by his enthusiasm, forgot all the circumstances of our journey, the extraordinary position in which we were placed, the immense cavern which stretched far away over our heads. There can be no doubt that he thought himself at the institution, addressing his attentive pupils, for he put on his most doctorial style, waved his hand, and began:
Gentlemen, I have the honor on this auspicious occasion to present to you a man of the quaternary period of our globe. Many learned men have denied his very existence, while other able persons, perhaps of even higher authority, have affirmed their belief in the reality of his life. If the St. Thomases of paleontology were present, they would reverentially touch him with their fingers and believe in his existence, thus acknowledging their obstinate heresy. I know that science should be careful in relation to all discoveries of this nature. I am not without having heard of the many Barnums and other quacks who have made a trade of such like pretended discoveries. I have of course heard of the discovery of the knee bones of Ajax, or the pretended finding of the body of Orestes by the Spartiates, and of the body of Asterius, 10 spans long, 15 feet, of which we read in Pausanias. I have read everything in relation to the skeleton of Trapani, discovered in the 14th century, and which many persons chose to regard as that of Polyphemus, and the history of the giant dug up during the 16th century in the environs of Palmyra. You are well aware, as I am, gentlemen, of the existence of the celebrated analysis made near Lucerne in 1577, of the great bones which the celebrated Dr. Felix Plater declared belonged to a giant about 19 feet high. I have devoured all the treatises of Cassanion, and all those memoirs, pamphlets, speeches, and replies published in reference to the skeleton of Teutobochus, king of the Cimbri, the invader of Gaul, dug out of a gravel pit in Dauphin in 1613. In the 18th century I should have denied, with Peter Campet, the existence of the pre-Adamites of Scheuchzer. I have had in my hands the writing called Gigans.
Here my uncle was afflicted by the natural infirmity which prevented him from pronouncing difficult words in public. It was not exactly stuttering, but a strange sort of constitutional hesitation.
The writing named Gigans,
he repeated. He, however, could get no further.
Giganteo.
Impossible. The unfortunate word would not come out. There would have been great laughter at the institution had the mistake happened there.
Gigantos theologi,
at last exclaimed Professor Hardwigg between two savage growls. Having got over our difficulty and getting more and more excited.
Yes, gentlemen, I am well acquainted with all these matters, and know also that Cuvier and Blumenbach fully recognized in these bones the undeniable remains of mammoths of the quaternary period. But after what we now see, to allow a doubt is to insult scientific inquiry. There is the body. You can see it, you can touch it. It is not a skeleton. It is a complete and uninjured body, preserved with an anthropological object.
I did not attempt to controvert this singular and astounding assertion.
If I could but wash this corpse in a solution of sulphuric acid,
continued my uncle,
I would undertake to remove all the earthy particles and these resplendent shells which are encrusted all over this body. But I am without this precious dissolving medium. Nevertheless, such as it is, this body will tell its own history."
Here the Professor held up the fossil body and exhibited it with rare dexterity. No professional showman could have shown more activity.
"As on examination you will see," my uncle continued, "it is only about 6 feet in length, which is a long way from the pretended giants of early days. As to the particular race to which it belonged, it is incontestably Caucasian. It is of the white race, that is, of our own. The skull of this fossil being is a perfect ovid, without any remarkable or prominent development of the cheekbones, and without any projection of the jaw. It presents no indication of the prognathism, which modifies the facial angle.
Note. The facial angle is formed by two planes, one more or less vertical, which is in a straight line with the forehead and the incisors; the other horizontal, which passes through the organs of hearing and the lower nasal bone. Prognathism, in anthropological language, means that particular projection of the jaw which modifies the facial angle. End of note.
Measure the angle for yourselves, and you will find that it is just 90 degrees. But I will advance still farther, on the road of inquiry and deduction, and I dare venture to say that this human sample or specimen belongs to the Japhetic family, which spread over the world from India to the uttermost limits of Western Europe. There is no occasion, gentlemen, to smile at my remarks."
Of course nobody smiled, but the excellent Professor was so accustomed to beaming countenances at his lectures, that he believed he saw all his audience laughing during the delivery of his learned dissertation.
"Yes," he
continued, with renewed animation,
"this is a fossil man, a contemporary of the mastodons, with the bones of which this whole amphitheatre is covered. But if I am called on to explain how he came to this place, how these various strata by which he is covered have fallen into this vast cavity, I can undertake to give you no explanation. Doubtless, if we carry ourselves back to the Quaternary epoch, we shall find that great and mighty convulsions took place in the crust of the earth. The continually cooling operation through which the earth had to pass produced fissures, landslips, and chasms, through which a large portion of the earth made its way. I come to no absolute conclusion, but there is the man, surrounded by the works of his hands, his hatchets, and his carved flints, which belong to the stony period, and the only rational supposition is, that, like myself, he visited the centre of the earth as a travelling tourist, a pioneer of science. At all events, there can be no doubt of his great age, and of his being one of the oldest race of human beings."
The Professor with these words ceased his oration, and I burst forth into loud and unanimous applause. Besides, after all, my uncle was right. Much more learned men than his nephew would have found it rather hard to refute his facts and arguments. Another circumstance soon presented itself. This fossilized body was not the only one in this vast plain of bones, the cemetery of an extinct world. Other bodies were found as we trod the dusty plain, and my uncle was able to choose the most marvelous of these specimens in order to convince the most incredulous. In truth, it was a surprising spectacle, the successive remains of generations and generations of men and animals confounded together in one vast cemetery. But a great question now presented itself to our notice, and one we were actually afraid to contemplate in all its bearings. Had these once animated beings been buried so far beneath the soil by some tremendous convulsion of nature, after they had been earth to earth and ashes to ashes, or had they lived here below, in this subterranean world, under this factitious sky, born, married, and given in marriage, and died at last, just like ordinary inhabitants of the earth. Up to the present moment, marine monsters, fish, and such like animals had alone been seen alive. The question, which rendered us rather uneasy, was a pertinent one. Were any of these men of the abyss wandering about the deserted shores of this wondrous sea of the centre of the earth? This was a question which rendered me very uneasy and uncomfortable. How, should they really be in existence, would they receive us men from above? End of chapter 35. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 36 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 36. What is it? For a long and weary hour we tramped over this great bed of bones. We advanced regardless of everything, drawn on by ardent curiosity. What other marvels did this great cavern contain? What other wondrous treasures for the scientific man? My eyes were quite prepared for any number of surprises, my imagination lived in expectation of something new and wonderful. The borders of the great central ocean had for some time disappeared behind the hills that were scattered over the ground occupied by the plain of bones. The imprudent and enthusiastic professor, who did not care whether he lost himself or not, hurried me forward. We advanced silently, bathed in waves of electric fluid. By reason of a phenomenon which I cannot explain, and thanks to its extreme diffusion, now complete, the light illumined equally the sides of every hill and rock. Its seat appeared to be nowhere, in no determined force, and produced no shade whatever. The appearance presented was that of a tropical country at midday in summer, in the midst of the equatorial regions, and under the vertical rays of the sun. All signs of vapor had disappeared. The rocks, the distant mountains, some confused masses of far-off forests, assumed a weird and mysterious aspect under this equal distribution of the luminous fluid. We resembled to a certain extent the mysterious personage in one of Hoffmann's fantastic tales, the man who lost his shadow. After we had walked about a mile farther, we came to the edge of a vast forest, not, however, one of the vast mushroom forests we had discovered near Port Gretchen. It was the glorious and wild vegetation of the Tertiary period in all its superb magnificence. Huge palms of a species now unknown, superb palmacites, a genus of fossil palms from the coal formation, pines, yews, cypress, and conifers or cone-bearing trees, the whole bound together by an inextricable and complicated mass of creeping plants. A beautiful carpet of mosses and ferns grew beneath the trees. Pleasant brooks murmured beneath umbrageous boughs little worthy of this name, for no shade did they give. Upon their borders grew small tree-like shrubs, such as are seen in the hot countries on our own inhabited globe. The one thing wanting in these plants, these shrubs, these trees, was color. Forever deprived of the vivifying warmth of the sun, they were vapid and colorless. All shade was lost in one uniform tint of a brown and faded character. The leaves were wholly devoid of verdure, and the flowers, so numerous during the Tertiary period which gave them birth, were without color and without perfume, something like paper discolored by long exposure to the atmosphere. My uncle ventured beneath the gigantic groves. I followed him. though not without a certain amount of apprehension, since nature had shown herself capable of producing such stupendous vegetable supplies. Why might we not meet with mammals just as large and therefore dangerous? I particularly remarked in the clearings left by trees that had fallen and been partially consumed by time, many leguminous bean like shrubs, such as the maple and other eatable trees, dear to ruminating animals. Then there appeared, confounded together and intermixed, the trees of such varied lands, specimens of the vegetation of every part of the globe. There was the oak near the palm tree, the Australian eucalyptus, an interesting class of the order Myrtaceae, leaning against the tall Norwegian pine, the poplar of the north mixing its branches with those of the New Zealand kauris. It was enough to drive the most ingenious classifier of the upper regions out of his mind, and to upset all his received ideas about botany. Suddenly I stopped short and restrained my uncle. The extreme diffuseness of the light enabled me to see the smallest objects in the distant copses. I thought I saw. No, I really did see, with my own eyes, immense, gigantic animals moving about under the mighty trees. Yes, they were truly gigantic animals, a whole herd of mastodons, not fossils, but living, and exactly like those discovered in 1801 on the marshy banks of the great Ohio in North America. Yes, I could see these enormous elephants, whose trunks were tearing down large boughs and working in and out the trees like a legion of serpents. I could hear the sounds of the mighty tusks uprooting huge trees. The boughs crackled, and the whole masses of leaves and green branches went down the capacious throats of these terrible monsters. That wondrous dream, when I saw the antehistorical times revivified, when the tertiary and quaternary periods passed before me, was now realized. And there we were alone, far down in the bowels of the earth, at the mercy of its ferocious inhabitants. My uncle paused, full of wonder and astonishment.
Come,
he said at last, when his first surprise was over.
Come along, my boy, and let us see them nearer.
No, replied I, restraining his efforts to drag me forward. We are wholly without arms. What should we do in the midst of that flock of gigantic quadrupeds? Come away, uncle, I implore you. No human creature can with impunity brave the ferocious anger of these monsters.
No human creature,
said my uncle, suddenly lowering his voice to a mysterious whisper.
You are mistaken, my dear Henry. Look, look yonder. It seems to me that I behold a human being, a being like ourselves, a man.
I looked, shrugging my shoulders, decided to push incredulity to its very last limits. But whatever might have been my wish, I was compelled to yield to the weight of ocular demonstration. Yes, not more than a quarter of a mile off, leaning against the trunk of an enormous tree, was a human being. A Proteus of these subterranean regions, a new son of Neptune, keeping this innumerable herd of mastodons. Immanis pecoris custos immanior ipse. The keeper of gigantic cattle, himself still more gigantic. Yes, it was no longer a fossil whose corpse we had raised from the ground in the great cemetery, but a giant capable of guiding and driving these prodigious monsters. His height was above 12 feet. His head, as big as the head of a buffalo, was lost in a mane of matted hair. It was indeed a huge mane, like those which belonged to the elephants of the earlier ages of the world. In his hand was a branch of a tree, which served as a crook for this antediluvian shepherd. We remained profoundly still, speechless with surprise. But we might at any moment be seen by him. Nothing remained for us but instant flight. "Come, come!" I cried, dragging my uncle along, and for the first time he made no resistance to my wishes. A quarter of an hour later we were far away from that terrible monster. Now that I think of the matter calmly, and that I reflect upon it dispassionately, now that months, years have passed since this strange and unnatural adventure befell us, what am I to think? What am I to believe? No, it is utterly impossible. Our ears must have deceived us, and our eyes have cheated us. We have not seen what we believed we had seen. No human being could by any possibility have existed in that subterranean world. No generation of men could inhabit the lower caverns of the globe without taking note of those who peopled the surface, without communication with them. It was folly, 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 nothing else. I am rather inclined to admit the existence of some animal resembling in structure the human race, of some monkey of the first geological epochs, like that discovered by Monsieur Lartet in the ossiferous deposit of Sansan. But this animal, or being, whichsoever it was, surpassed in height all things known to modern science. Never mind, however unlikely it may be, it might have been a monkey, but a man, a living man, and with him a whole generation of gigantic animals buried in the entrails of the earth. It was too monstrous to be believed. End of chapter 36. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 37 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 37. The Mysterious Dagger. During this time we had left the bright and transparent forest far behind us. We were mute with astonishment, overcome by a kind of feeling which was next door to apathy. We kept running in spite of ourselves. It was a perfect right, which resembled one of those horrible sensations we sometimes meet in our dreams. Instinctively we made our way towards the central sea, and I cannot now tell what wild thoughts passed through my mind, nor of what follies I might have been guilty, but for a very serious preoccupation which brought me back to practical life. Though I was aware that we were treading on a soil quite new to us, I, however, every now and then noticed certain aggregations of rock, the shape of which forcibly reminded me of those near Port Gretchen. This confirmed, moreover, the indications of the compass and our extraordinary and unlooked for, as well as involuntary, return to the north of this great central sea. It was so like our starting point that I could scarcely doubt the reality of our position. Streams and cascades fell in hundreds over the numerous projections of the rocks. I actually thought I could see our faithful and monotonous Hans and the wonderful grotto in which I had come back to life after my tremendous fall. Then, as we advanced still farther, the position of the cliffs, the appearance of a stream, the unexpected profile of a rock, threw me again into a state of bewildering doubt. After some time I explained my state of mental indecision to my uncle. He confessed to a similar feeling of hesitation. He was totally unable to make up his mind in the midst of this extraordinary but uniform panorama. "There can be no doubt," I insisted, "that we have not landed exactly at the place whence we first took our departure, but the tempest has brought us above our starting point. I think, therefore, that if we follow the coast we shall once more find Port Gretchen."
"In that case," cried my uncle, "it is useless to continue our exploration. The very best thing we can do is to make our way back to the raft. Are you quite sure, Harry, that you are not mistaken?"
"It is difficult," was my reply, "to come to any decision, for all these rocks are exactly alike. There is no marked difference between them. At the same time, the impression on my mind is that I recognize the promontory at the foot of which our worthy Hans constructed the raft. We are, I am nearly convinced, near the little port. If this be not it," I added, carefully examining a creek which appeared singularly familiar to my mind.
"My dear Harry, if this were the case, we should find traces of our own footsteps, some signs of our passage, and I can really see nothing to indicate our having passed this way."
"But I see something," I cried in an impetuous tone of voice, as I rushed forward and eagerly picked up something which shone in the sand under my feet.
"What is it?"
cried the astonished and bewildered Professor. "This," was my reply. And I handed to my startled relative a rusty dagger of singular shape.
"What made you bring with you so useless a weapon?" he exclaimed. "It was needlessly hampering yourself."
"I bring it? It is quite new to me. I never saw it before. Are you sure it's not out of your collection?"
"Nor that I know of," said the Professor, puzzled. "I have no recollection of the circumstance. It was never my property."
"This is very extraordinary," I said, musing over the novel and singular incident.
"Not at all. There is a very simple explanation, Harry. The Icelanders are known to keep up the use of these antiquated weapons, and this must have belonged to Hans, who has let it fall without knowing it."
I shook my head. That dagger had never been in the possession of the pacific and taciturn Hans. I knew him and his habits too well. "Then what can it be, unless it be the weapon of some antediluvian warrior," I continued, "of some living man, a contemporary of that mighty shepherd from whom we have just escaped? But no, mystery upon mystery, this is no weapon of the stony epoch, nor even of the bronze period. It is made of excellent steel." Ere I could finish my sentence, my uncle stopped me short from entering upon a whole train of theories, and spoke in his most cold and decided tone of voice.
"Calm yourself, my dear boy, and endeavor to use your reason. This weapon, upon which we have fallen so unexpectedly, is a true dag, one of those worn by gentlemen in their belts during the 16th century. Its use was to give the coup de grace, the final blow to the foe who would not surrender. It is clearly of Spanish workmanship. It belongs neither to you nor to me, nor to the eiderdown hunter, nor to any of the living beings who may still exist so marvelously in the interior of the earth."
"What can you mean, uncle?" I said, now lost in a host of surmises.
"Look closely at it," he continued. "These jagged edges were never made by the resistance of human blood and bone. The blade is covered with a regular coating of iron mold and rust, which is not a day old, not a year old, nor a century old, but much more."
The Professor began to get quite excited, according to custom, and was allowing himself to be carried away by his fertile imagination. I could have said something. He stopped me.
"Harry," he cried, "we are now on the verge of a great discovery. This blade of a dagger you have so marvelously discovered, after being abandoned upon the sand for more than 100, 200, even 300 years, has been indented by someone endeavoring to carve an inscription on these rocks."
"But this poniard never got here of itself," I exclaimed. "It could not have twisted itself. Some one, therefore, must have preceded us upon the shores of this extraordinary sea."
"Yes, a man."
"But what man has been sufficiently desperate to do such a thing?"
"A man who has somewhere written his name with this very dagger. A man who has endeavored once more to indicate the right road to the interior of the earth. Let us look around, my boy. You know not the importance of your singular and happy discovery."
Prodigiously interested, we walked along the wall of rock, examining the smallest fissures, which might finally expand into the much wished for gully or shaft. We at last reached a spot where the shore became extremely narrow. The sea almost bathed the foot of the rocks, which were here very lofty and steep. There was scarcely a path wider than 2 yards at any point. At last, under a huge overhanging rock, we discovered the entrance of a dark and gloomy tunnel. There, on a square tablet of granite, which had been smoothed by rubbing it with another stone, we could see two mysterious and much worn letters, the two initials of the bold and extraordinary traveler who had preceded us on our adventurous journey.
"A.S.," cried my uncle. "You see I was right. Arne Saknussemm. Always Arne Saknussemm."
End of chapter 37. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 38 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 38. No Outlet. Blasting the Rock. Ever since the commencement of our marvelous journey, I had experienced many surprises, had suffered from many illusions. I thought that I was case hardened against all surprises, and could neither see nor hear anything to amaze me again. I was like a man who, having been round the world, finds himself wholly blasé and proof against the marvelous. When, however, I saw these two letters, which had been engraven 300 years before, I stood fixed in an attitude of mute surprise. Not only was there the signature of the learned and enterprising alchemist written in the rock, but I held in my hand the very identical instrument with which he had laboriously engraved it. It was impossible, without showing an amount of incredulity scarcely becoming a sane man, to deny the existence of the traveler, and the reality of that voyage, which I believed all along to have been a myth, the mystification of some fertile brain. While these reflections were passing through my mind, my uncle, the professor, gave way to an excess of feverish and poetical excitement.
"Wonderful and glorious genius, great Saknussemm!" he cried. "You have left no stone unturned, no resource omitted, to show to other mortals the way into the interior of our mighty globe, and your fellow creatures can find the trail left by your illustrious footsteps 300 years ago, at the bottom of these obscure subterranean abodes. You have been careful to secure for others the contemplation of these wonders and marvels of creation. Your name engraved at every important stage of our glorious journey leads the hopeful traveler direct to the great and mighty discovery to which you devoted such energy and courage. The audacious traveler who shall follow your footsteps to the last will doubtless find your initials engraved with your own hand upon the center of the earth. I will be that audacious traveler. I, too, will sign my name upon the very same spot upon the central granite stone of this wondrous work of the Creator. But in justice to your devotion, to your courage, and to your being the first to indicate the road, let this cape, seen by you upon the shores of this sea discovered by you, be called, of all time, Cape Saknussemm."
This is what I heard, and I began to be roused to the pitch of enthusiasm indicated by those words. A fierce excitement roused me. I forgot everything. The dangers of the voyage and the perils of the return journey were now as nothing. What another man had done in ages past could, I felt, be done again. I was determined to do it myself, and now nothing that man had accomplished appeared to me impossible. "Forward! Forward!" I cried in a burst of genuine and hearty enthusiasm. I had already started in the direction of the somber and gloomy gallery, when the Professor stopped me. He, the man so rash and hasty, he, the man so easily roused to the highest pitch of enthusiasm, checked me, and asked me to be patient and show more calm.
"Let us return to our good friend Hans," he said. "We will then bring the raft down to this place."
I must say that though I at once yielded to my uncle's request, it was not without dissatisfaction, and I hastened along the rocks of that wonderful coast. "Do you know, my dear uncle," I said as we walked along, "that we have been singularly helped by a concurrence of circumstances right up to this very moment?"
"So you begin to see it, do you, Harry?"
said the Professor with a smile. "Doubtless," I responded, "and strangely enough, even the tempest has been the means of putting us on the right road. Blessings on the tempest! It brought us safely back to the very spot from which fine weather would have driven us forever. Supposing we had succeeded in reaching the southern and distant shores of this extraordinary sea, what would have become of us? The name of Saknussemm would never have appeared to us, and at this moment we should have been cast away upon an inhospitable coast, probably without an outlet."
"Yes, Harry, my boy, there is certainly something providential in that wandering at the mercy of wind and waves towards the south. We have come back exactly north, and what is better still, we fall upon this great discovery of Cape Saknussemm. I mean to say that it is more than surprising. There is something in it which is far beyond my comprehension. The coincidence is unheard of, marvelous."
"What matter? It is not our duty to explain facts, but to make the best possible use of them."
"Doubtless, my boy. But if you will allow me," said the really delighted Professor.
"Excuse me, sir, but I see exactly how it will be. We shall take the northern route. We shall pass under the northern regions of Europe, under Sweden, under Russia, under Siberia, and who knows where, instead of burying ourselves under the burning plains and deserts of Africa, or beneath the mighty waves of the ocean. And that is all, at this stage of our journey, that I care to know. Let us advance, and Heaven will be our guide."
"Yes, Harry, you are right, quite right. All is for the best. Let us abandon this horizontal sea, which could never have led to anything satisfactory. We shall descend, descend, and everlastingly descend. Do you know, my dear boy, that to reach the interior of the earth we have only 5,000 miles to travel?"
"Bah!" I cried, carried away by a burst of enthusiasm. "The distance is scarcely worth speaking about. The thing is to make a start." My wild, mad, and incoherent speeches continued until we rejoined our patient and phlegmatic guide. All was, we found, prepared for an immediate departure. There was not a single parcel but what was in its proper place. We all took up our posts on the raft, and the sail being hoisted, Hans received his directions and guided the frail bark towards Cape Saknussemm as we had definitely named it. The wind was very unfavorable to a craft that was unable to sail close to the wind. It was constructed to go before the blast. We were continually reduced to pushing ourselves forward by means of poles. On several occasions the rocks ran far out into deep water, and we were compelled to make a long round. At last, after 3 long and weary hours of navigation, that is to say, about 6 o'clock in the evening, we found a place at which we could land. I jumped on shore first. In my present state of excitement and enthusiasm, I was always first. My uncle and the Icelander followed. The voyage from the port to this point of the sea had by no means calmed me. It had rather produced the opposite effect. I even proposed to burn our vessel, that is, to destroy our raft, in order to completely cut off our retreat. But my uncle sternly opposed this wild project. I began to think him particularly lukewarm and unenthusiastic. "At any rate, my dear uncle," I said, "let us start without delay."
Yes, my boy, I'm quite as eager to do so as you can be. But in the first place, let us examine this mysterious gallery in order to find if we shall need to prepare and mend our ladders." My uncle now began to see the efficiency of our Ruhmkorff coil, which would doubtless soon be needed. The raft, securely fastened to a rock, was left alone. Moreover, the opening into the new gallery was not 20 paces distant from the spot. Our little troop, with myself at the head, advanced. The orifice, which was almost circular, presented a diameter of about 5 feet. The somber tunnel was cut in the living rock, and coated on the inside by the different materials which had once passed through it in a state of fusion. The lower part was about level with the water, so that we were able to penetrate to the interior without difficulty. We followed an almost horizontal direction, when, at the end of about a dozen paces, our further advance was checked by the interposition of an enormous block of granite rock. "A cursed stone!" I cried furiously, on perceiving that we were stopped by what seemed an insurmountable obstacle. In vain we looked to the right, in vain we looked to the left, in vain examined it above and below. There existed no passage, no sign of any other tunnel. I experienced the most bitter and painful disappointment. So enraged was I that I would not admit the reality of any obstacle. I stooped to my knees. I looked under the mass of stone. No hole, no interstice. I then looked above. The same barrier of granite. Hans with the lamp examined the sides of the tunnel in every direction. But all in vain. It was necessary to renounce all hope of passing through. I had seated myself upon the ground. My uncle walked angrily and hopelessly up and down. He was evidently desperate. "But," I cried after some moments' thought, "what about Arne Saknussemm?" You are right, replied my uncle. He can never have been checked by a lump of rock.
"No, 10,000 times no!" I cried with extreme vivacity. "This huge lump of rock, in consequence of some singular concussion or process, one of those magnetic phenomena which have so often shaken the terrestrial crust, has in some unexpected way closed up the passage. Many and many years have passed away since the return of Saknussemm and the fall of this huge block of granite. Is it not quite evident that this gallery was formerly the outlet for the pent up lava in the interior of the earth, and that these eruptive matters then circulated freely? Look at these recent fissures in the granite roof. It is evidently formed of pieces of enormous stone, placed here as if by the hand of a giant who had worked to make a strong and substantial arch. One day, after an unusually strong shock, the vast rock which stands in our way and which was doubtless the key of a kind of arch, fell through to a level with the soil, and has barred our further progress. We are right, then, in thinking that this is an unexpected obstacle, with which Saknussemm did not meet, and if we do not upset it in some way, we are unworthy of following in the footsteps of the great discoverer, and incapable of finding our way to the center of the earth. In this wild way I addressed my uncle. The zeal of the Professor, his earnest longing for success, had become part and parcel of my being. I wholly forgot the past. I utterly despised the future. Nothing existed for me upon the surface of this spheroid, in the bosom of which I was engulfed. No towns, no country, no Hamburg, no Königstrasse, not even my poor Gretchen, who by this time would believe me utterly lost in the interior of the earth.
Well, cried my uncle,
Roused to enthusiasm by my words,
let us go to work with pickaxes, with crowbars, with anything that comes to hand, but down with these terrible walls.
It is far too tough and too big to be destroyed by a pickaxe or crowbar, I replied.
What then?
As I said, it is useless to think of overcoming such a difficulty by means of ordinary tools.
What then?
What else but gunpowder, a subterranean mine? Let us blow up the obstacle that stands in our way.
Gunpowder?
Yes, all we have to do is to get rid of this paltry obstacle.
To work, Hans, to work, cried the Professor.
The Icelander went back to the raft and soon returned with a huge crowbar, with which he began to dig a hole in the rock, which was to serve as a mine. It was by no means a slight task. It was necessary for our purpose to make a cavity large enough to hold 50 pounds of fulminating gun cotton, the expansive power of which is 4 times as great as that of ordinary gunpowder. I had now roused myself to an almost miraculous state of excitement. While Hans was at work, I actively assisted my uncle to prepare a long wick, made from damp gunpowder, the mass of which we finally enclosed in a bag of linen. "We are bound to go through," I cried enthusiastically.
We are bound to go through,
responded the Professor, tapping me on the back. At midnight our work as miners was completely finished. The charge of fulminating cotton was thrust into the hollow, and the match, which we had made of considerable length, was ready. A spark was now sufficient to ignite this formidable engine, and to blow the rock to atoms.
We will now rest until tomorrow.
It was absolutely necessary to resign myself to my fate, and to consent to wait for the explosion for 6 weary hours. End of chapter 38. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 39 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 39. The Explosion and its Results. The next day, which was the 27th of August, was a date celebrated in our wondrous subterranean journey. I never think of it even now, but I shudder with horror. My heart beats wildly at the very memory of that awful day. From this time forward, our reason, our judgment, our human ingenuity have nothing to do with the course of events. We are about to become the plaything of the great phenomena of the earth. At 6 o'clock we were all up and ready. The dreaded moment was arriving when we were about to seek an opening into the interior of the earth by means of gunpowder. What would be the consequences of breaking through the crust of the earth? I begged that it might be my duty to set fire to the mine. I looked upon it as an honor. This task once performed, I could rejoin my friends upon the raft, which had not been unloaded. As soon as we were all ready, we were to sail away to some distance, to avoid the consequences of the explosion, the effects of which would certainly not be concentrated in the interior of the earth. The slow match we calculated to burn for about 10 minutes, more or less, before it reached the chamber in which the great body of powder was confined. I should therefore have plenty of time to reach the raft and put off to a safe distance. I prepared to execute my self allotted task, not, it must be confessed, without considerable emotion. After a hearty repast, my uncle and the hunter guide embarked on board the raft, while I remained alone upon the desolate shore. I was provided with a lantern, which was to enable me to set fire to the wick of the infernal machine.
"Go, my boy," said my uncle, "and heaven be with you. But come back as soon as you can. I shall be all impatience."
"Be easy on that matter," I replied. "There is no fear of my delaying on the road." Having said this, I advanced toward the opening of the somber gallery. My heart beat wildly. I opened my lantern and seized the extremity of the wick. The Professor, who was looking on, held his chronometer in his hand.
"Are you ready?"
cried he. "Quite ready."
"Well, then, fire away."
I hastened to put the light to the wick, which crackled and sparkled, hissing and spitting like a serpent. Then, running as fast as I could, I returned to the shore.
"Get on board, my lad, and you, Hans, show off," cried my uncle.
By a vigorous application of his pole, Hans sent us flying over the water. The raft was quite 20 fathoms distant. It was a moment of palpitating interest, of deep anxiety. My uncle, the Professor, never took his eyes off the chronometer.
"Only 5 minutes more," he said in a low tone. "Only 4, only 3."
My pulse went 100 to the minute. I could hear my heart beating.
"Only 2, 1. Now then, mountains of granite, crumble beneath the power of man."
What happened after that? As to the terrific roar of the explosion, I do not think I heard it. But the form of the rocks completely changed in my eyes. They seemed to be drawn aside like a curtain. I saw a fathomless, a bottomless abyss, which yawned beneath the turgid waves. The sea, which seemed suddenly to have gone mad, then became one great mountainous mass, upon the top of which the raft rose perpendicularly. We were all thrown down. In less than a second the light gave place to the most profound obscurity. Then I felt all solid support give way, not to my feet, but to the raft itself. I thought it was going bodily down a tremendous well. I tried to speak, to question my uncle. Nothing could be heard but the roaring of the mighty waves. We clung together in utter silence. Despite the awful darkness, despite the noise, the surprise, the emotion, I thoroughly understood what had happened. Beyond the rock which had been blown up, there existed a mighty abyss. The explosion had caused a kind of earthquake in this soil, broken by fissures and rents. The gulf, thus suddenly thrown open, was about to swallow the inland sea, which, transformed into a mighty torrent, was dragging us with it. Only one idea filled my mind. We were utterly and completely lost. 1 hour, 2 hours, what more I cannot say, passed in this manner. We sat close together, elbow touching elbow, knee touching knee. We held one another's hands not to be thrown off the raft. We were subjected to the most violent shocks whenever our sole dependence, a frail wooden raft, struck against the rocky sides of the channel. Fortunately for us, these concussions became less and less frequent, which made me fancy that the gallery was getting wider and wider. There could be now no doubt that we had chanced upon the road once followed by Saknussemm, but instead of going down in a proper manner, we had, through our own imprudence, drawn a whole sea with us. These ideas presented themselves to my mind in a very vague and obscure manner. I felt rather than reasoned. I put my ideas together only confusedly, while spinning along like a man going down a waterfall. To judge by the air which, as it were, whipped my face, we must have been rushing at a perfectly lightning rate. To attempt under these circumstances to light a torch was simply impossible, and the last remains of our electric machine, of our Ruhmkorff coil, had been destroyed during the fearful explosion. I was therefore very much confused to see at last a bright light shining close to me. The calm countenance of the guide seemed to gleam upon me. The clever and patient hunter had succeeded in lighting the lantern, and though, in the keen and thorough draught, the flame flickered and vacillated and was nearly put out, it served partially to dissipate the awful obscurity. The gallery into which we had entered was very wide. I was therefore quite right in that part of my conjecture. The insufficient light did not allow us to see both of the walls at the same time. The slope of waters which was carrying us away was far greater than that of the most rapid river of America. The whole surface of the stream seemed to be composed of liquid arrows, darted forward with extreme violence and power. I can give no idea of the impression it made upon me. The raft at times caught in certain whirlpools, and rushed forward, yet turned on itself all the time. How it did not upset I shall never be able to understand. When it approached the sides of the gallery, I took care to throw upon them the light of the lantern, and I was able to judge of the rapidity of motion by looking at the projecting masses of rock, which, as soon as seen, were again invisible. So rapid was our progress that points of rock at a considerable distance one from the other appeared like portions of transverse lines, which enclosed us in a kind of net, like that of a line of telegraphic wires. I believe we were now going at a rate of not less than 100 miles an hour. My uncle and I looked at one another with wild and haggard eyes. We clung convulsively to the stump of the mast, which, at the moment when the catastrophe took place, had snapped short off. We turned our backs as much as possible to the wind, in order not to be stifled by a rapidity of motion which nothing human could face and live. And still the long monotonous hours went on. The situation did not change in the least, though a discovery I suddenly made seemed to complicate it very much. When we had slightly recovered our equilibrium, I proceeded to examine our cargo. I then made the unsatisfactory discovery that the greater part of it had utterly disappeared. I became alarmed and determined to discover what were our resources. My heart beat at the idea, but it was absolutely necessary to know on what we had to depend. With this view I took the lantern and looked around. Of all our former collection of nautical and philosophical instruments, there remained only the chronometer and the compass. The ladders and ropes were reduced to a small piece of rope fastened to the stump of the mast. Not a pickaxe, not a crowbar, not a hammer, and, far worse than all, no food, not enough for one day. This discovery was a prelude to a certain and horrible death. Seated gloomily on the raft, clasping the stump of the mast mechanically, I thought of all I had read as to sufferings from starvation. I remembered everything that history had taught me on the subject, and I shuddered at the remembrance of the agonies to be endured. Maddened at the prospects of enduring the miseries of starvation, I persuaded myself that I must be mistaken. I examined the cracks in the raft, I poked between the joints and beams, I examined every possible hole and corner. The result was simply nothing. Our stock of provisions consisted of nothing but a piece of dry meat and some soaked and half mouldy biscuits. I gazed around me, scared and frightened. I could not understand the awful truth. And yet, of what consequence was it in regard to any new danger? Supposing that we had had provisions for months, and even for years, how could we ever get out of the awful abyss into which we were being hurled by the irresistible torrent we had let loose? Why should we trouble ourselves about the sufferings and tortures to be endured from hunger, when death stared us in the face under so many other swifter and perhaps even more horrid forms? It was very doubtful, under the circumstances in which we were placed, if we should have time to die of inanition. But the human frame is singularly constituted. I know not how it was, but from some singular hallucination of mind I forgot the real, serious, and immediate danger to which we were exposed, to think of the menaces of the future, which appeared before us in all their naked terror. Besides, after all, suggested hope, perhaps we might finally escape the fury of the raging torrent, and once more revisit the glimpses of the moon on the surface of our beautiful Mother Earth. How was it to be done? I had not the remotest idea. Where were we to come out? No matter, so that we did. One chance in 1,000 is always a chance, while death from hunger gave us not even the faintest glimpse of hope. It left to the imagination nothing but blank horror, without the faintest chance of escape. I had the greatest mind to reveal all to my uncle, to explain to him the extraordinary and wretched position to which we were reduced, in order that, between the two, we might make a calculation as to the exact space of time which remained for us to live. It was, it appeared to me, the only thing to be done. But I had the courage to hold my tongue, to gnaw at my entrails like the Spartan boy. I wished to leave him all his coolness. At this moment the light of the lantern slowly fell, and at last went out. The wick had wholly burnt to an end. The obscurity became absolute. It was no longer possible to see through the impenetrable darkness. There was one torch left, but it was impossible to keep it alight. Then, like a child, I shut my eyes, that I might not see the darkness. After a great lapse of time, the rapidity of our journey increased. I could feel it by the rush of air upon my face. The slope of the waters was excessive. I began to feel that we were no longer going down a slope. We were falling. I felt as one does in a dream, going down bodily, falling, falling, falling. I felt that the hands of my uncle and Hans were vigorously clasping my arms. Suddenly, after a lapse of time scarcely appreciable, I felt something like a shock. The raft had not struck a hard body, but had suddenly been checked in its course. A waterspout, a liquid column of water fell upon us. I felt suffocating. I was being drowned. Still, the sudden inundation did not last. In a few seconds I felt myself once more able to breathe. My uncle and Hans pressed my arms, and the raft carried us all three away. End of chapter 39. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 40 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 40. The Ape Gigants. It is difficult for me to determine what was the real time, but I should suppose by after calculation that it must have been 10 at night. I lay in a stupor, a half dream, during which I saw visions of astounding character. Monsters of the deep were side by side with the mighty elephantine shepherd. Gigantic fish and animals seemed to form strange conjunctions. The raft took a sudden turn, whirled round, entered another tunnel, this time illumined in a most singular manner. The roof was formed of porous stalactite, through which a moonlit vapor appeared to pass, casting its brilliant light upon our gaunt and haggard figures. The light increased as we advanced, while the roof ascended, until at last we were once more in a kind of water cavern, the lofty dome of which disappeared in a luminous cloud. A rugged cavern of small extent appeared to offer a halting place to our weary bodies. My uncle and the guide moved as men in a dream. I was afraid to waken them, knowing the danger of such a sudden start. I seated myself beside them to watch. As I did so, I became aware of something moving in the distance, which at once fascinated my eyes. It was floating, apparently, upon the surface of the water, advancing by means of what at first appeared paddles. I looked with glaring eyes. One glance told me that it was something monstrous. But what? It was the great shark crocodile of the early writers on geology. About the size of an ordinary whale, with hideous jaws and two gigantic eyes, it advanced, its eyes fixed on me with terrible sternness. Some indefinite warning told me that it had marked me for its own. I attempted to rise, to escape, no matter where, but my knees shook under me, my limbs trembled violently. I almost lost my senses. And still the mighty monster advanced. My uncle and the guide made no effort to save themselves. With a strange noise, like none other I had ever heard, the beast came on. His jaws were at least 7 feet apart, and his distended mouth looked large enough to have swallowed a boatful of men. We were about 10 feet distant when I discovered that much as his body resembled that of a crocodile, his mouth was fully that of a shark. His twofold nature now became apparent. To snatch us up at a mouthful it was necessary for him to turn on his back, which motion necessarily caused his legs to kick up helplessly in the air. I actually laughed, even in the very jaws of death. But next minute, with a wild cry, I darted away into the interior of the cave, leaving my unhappy comrades to their fate. This cavern was deep and dreary. After about 100 yards, I paused and looked around. The whole floor, composed of sand and malachite, was strewn with bones, freshly gnawed bones of reptiles and fish, with a mixture of mammalia. My very soul grew sick as my body shuddered with horror. I had truly, according to the old proverb, fallen out of the frying pan into the fire. Some beast larger and more ferocious even than the shark crocodile inhabited this den. What could I do? The mouth of the cave was guarded by one ferocious monster. The interior was inhabited by something too hideous to contemplate. Flight was impossible. Only one resource remained, and that was to find some small hiding place to which the fearful denizens of the cavern could not penetrate. I gazed wildly around, and at last discovered a fissure in the rock, to which I rushed in the hope of recovering my scattered senses. Crouching down, I waited, shivering as in an ague fit. No man is brave in presence of an earthquake, or a bursting boiler, or an exploding torpedo. I could not be expected to feel much courage in presence of the fearful fate that appeared to await me. An hour passed. I heard all the time a strange rumbling outside the cave. What was the fate of my unhappy companions? It was impossible for me to pause to inquire. My own wretched existence was all I could think of. Suddenly a groaning, as of 50 bears in a fight, fell upon my ears. Hisses, spitting, moaning, hideous to hear. And then I saw. Never, were ages to pass over my head, shall I forget the horrible apparition. It was the ape gigans. 14 feet high, covered with coarse hair of a blackish brown, the hair on the arms from the shoulder to the elbow joints pointing downwards, while that from the wrist to the elbow pointed upwards, it advanced. Its arms were as long as its body, while its legs were prodigious. It had thick, long, and sharply pointed teeth, like a mammoth saw. It struck its breast as it came on, smelling and sniffing, reminding me of the stories we read in our early childhood of giants who ate the flesh of men and little boys. Suddenly it stopped. My heart beat wildly, for I was conscious that, somehow or other, the fearful monster had smelled me out and was peering about with his hideous eyes to try and discover my whereabouts. My reading, which as a rule is a blessing, but which on this occasion seemed momentarily to prove a curse, told me the real truth. It was the ape gigans, the antediluvian gorilla. Yes, this awful monster, confined by good fortune to the interior of the earth, was a progenitor of the hideous monster of Africa. He glared wildly about, seeking something, doubtless myself. I gave myself up for lost. No hope of safety or escape seemed to remain. At this moment, just as my eyes appeared to close in death, there came a strange noise from the entrance of the cave, and turning, the gorilla evidently recognized some enemy more worthy of his prodigious size and strength. It was the huge shark crocodile, which, perhaps having disposed of my friends, was coming in search of further prey. The gorilla placed himself on the defensive, and clutching a bone some 7 or 8 feet in length, a perfect club, aimed a deadly blow at the hideous beast, which reared upwards and fell with all its weight upon its adversary. A terrible combat, the details of which it is impossible to give, now ensued. The struggle was awful and ferocious. I, however, did not wait to witness the result. Regarding myself as the object of contention, I determined to remove from the presence of the victor. I slid down from my hiding place, reached the ground, and gliding against the wall, strove to gain the open mouth of the cavern. But I had not taken many steps when the fearful clamor ceased, to be followed by mumbling and groaning which appeared to be indicative of victory. I looked back, and saw the huge ape, gory with blood, coming after me with glaring eyes, with dilated nostrils that gave forth 2 columns of heated vapor. I could feel his hot and fetid breath on my neck, and with a horrid jump awoke from my nightmare sleep. Yes, it was all a dream. I was still on the raft with my uncle and the guide. The relief was not instantaneous, for under the influence of the hideous nightmare my senses had become numbed. After a while, however, my feelings were tranquilized. The first of my perceptions, which returned in full force, was that of hearing. I listened with acute and attentive ears. All was still as death. All I comprehended was silence. To the roaring of waters, which had filled the gallery with awful reverberations, succeeded perfect peace. After some little time my uncle spoke in a low and scarcely audible tone.
"Harry, boy, where are you?"
"I'm here," was my faint rejoinder.
"Well, don't you see what has happened? We are going upwards."
"My dear uncle, what can you mean?" was my half delirious reply.
"Yes, I tell you we are ascending rapidly. Our downward journey is quite checked."
I held out my hand, and after some little difficulty succeeded in touching the wall. My hand was in an instant covered with blood. The skin was torn from the flesh. We were ascending with extraordinary rapidity.
"The torch! The torch!" cried the Professor wildly. "It must be lighted."
Hans, the guide, after many vain efforts, at last succeeded in lighting it, and the flame, having now nothing to prevent its burning, shed a tolerably clear light. We were enabled to form an approximate idea of the truth.
"It is just as I thought,"
said my uncle, after a moment or two of silent attention.
"We are in a narrow well, about 4 fathoms square. The waters of the great inland sea, having reached the bottom of the gulf, are now forcing themselves up the mighty shaft. As a natural consequence, we are being cast upon the summit of the waters."
"That I can see," was my lugubrious reply. "But where will this shaft end, and to what fall are we likely to be exposed?"
"Oh, that I am as ignorant as yourself. All I know is that we should be prepared for the worst. We are going up at a fearfully rapid rate. As far as I can judge, we are ascending at the rate of 2 fathoms a second, of 120 fathoms a minute, or rather more than 3½ leagues an hour. At this rate our fate will soon be a matter of certainty."
"No doubt of it," was my reply. "The great concern I have now, however, is to know whether this shaft has any issue. It may end in a granite roof, in which case we shall be suffocated by compressed air, or dashed to atoms against the top. I fancy already that the air is beginning to be close and condensed. I have a difficulty in breathing." This might be fancy, or it might be the effect of our rapid motion, but I certainly felt a great oppression of the chest.
"Henry," said the Professor, "I do believe that the situation is to a certain extent desperate. There remain, however, many chances of ultimate safety, and I have in my own mind been revolving them over. During your heavy but agitated sleep, I have come to this logical conclusion: whereas we may at any moment perish, so at any moment we may be saved. We need therefore prepare ourselves for whatever may turn up in the great chapter of accidents."
"But what would you have us do?" I cried. "Are we not utterly helpless?"
"No. While there is life there is hope. At all events, there is one thing we can do: eat, and thus obtain strength to face victory or death." As he spoke, I looked at my uncle with a haggard glance. I had put off the fatal communication as long as possible. It was now forced upon me, and I must tell him the truth. Still I hesitated. "Eat!" I said in a deprecating tone, as if there were no hurry. "Yes, and at once. I feel like a starving prisoner," he said, rubbing his yellow and shivering hands together. And turning round to the guide, he spoke some hearty, cheering words, as I judged from his tone, in Danish. Hans shook his head in a terribly significant manner. I tried to look unconcerned. "What!" cried the Professor, "you do not mean to say that all our provisions are lost?" "Yes," was my lowly spoken reply, as I held out something in my hand. "This morsel of dried meat is all that remains for us three."
My uncle gazed at me as if he could not fully appreciate the meaning of my words. The blow seemed to stun him by its severity. I allowed him to reflect for some moments. "Well," said I, after a short pause, "what do you think now? Is there any chance of our escaping from our horrible subterranean dangers? Are we not doomed to perish in the great hollows of the centre of the earth?" But my pertinent questions brought no answer. My uncle either heard me not, or appeared not to do so. And in this way a whole hour passed. Neither of us cared to speak. For myself, I began to feel the most fearful and devouring hunger. My companions doubtless felt the same horrible tortures, but neither of them would touch the wretched morsel of meat that remained. It lay there, a last remnant of all our great preparations for the mad and senseless journey. I looked back with wonderment to my own folly. Fully was I aware that despite his enthusiasm, and the ever to be hated scroll of Saknussemm, my uncle should never have started on his perilous voyage. What memories of the happy past, what previsions of the horrible future, now filled my brain. End of chapter 40. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 41 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 41. Hunger. Hunger prolonged is temporary madness. The brain is at work without its required food, and the most fantastic notions fill the mind. Hitherto I had never known what hunger really meant. I was likely to understand it now. And yet, 3 months before I could tell my terrible story of starvation, as I thought it, as a boy I used to make frequent excursions in the neighborhood of the professor's house. My uncle always acted on system, and he believed that, in addition to the day of rest and worship, there should be a day of recreation. In consequence, I was always free to do as I liked on a Wednesday. Now, as I had a notion to combine the useful and agreeable, my favorite pastime was bird's nesting. I had one of the best collections of eggs in all the town. They were classified and under glass cases. There was a certain wood, which, by rising at early morn and taking the cheap train, I could reach at 11 in the morning. Here I would botanize or geologize at my will. My uncle was always glad of specimens for his herbarium and stones to examine. When I had filled my wallet, I proceeded to search for nests. After about 2 hours of hard work, I one day sat down by a stream to eat my humble but copious lunch. How the remembrance of the spiced sausage, the wheaten loaf, and the beer made my mouth water now! I would have given every prospect of worldly wealth for such a meal. But to my story. While seated thus at my leisure, I looked up at the ruins of an old castle at no great distance. It was the remains of an historical dwelling, ivy clad, and now falling to pieces. While looking, I saw 2 eagles circling about the summit of a lofty tower. I soon became satisfied that there was a nest. Now, in all my collection, I lacked eggs of the native eagle and the large owl. My mind was made up. I would reach the summit of that tower or perish in the attempt. I went nearer and surveyed the ruins. The old staircase years before had fallen in. The outer walls were, however, intact. There was no chance that way unless I looked to the ivy solely for support. This was, as I soon found out, futile. There remained the chimney, which still went up to the top, and had once served to carry off the smoke from every story of the tower. Up this I determined to venture. It was narrow, rough, and therefore the more easily climbed. I took off my coat and crept into the chimney. Looking up, I saw a small, light opening, proclaiming the summit of the chimney. Up I went, for some time using my hands and knees, after the fashion of a chimney sweep. It was slow work, but there being continual projections, the task was comparatively easy. In this way I reached halfway. The chimney now became narrower, the atmosphere was close, and at last, to end the matter, I stuck fast. I could ascend no higher. There could be no doubt of this, and there remained no resource but to descend, and give up my glorious prey in despair. I yielded to fate and endeavored to descend, but I could not move. Some unseen and mysterious obstacle intervened and stopped me. In an instant the full horror of my situation seized me. I was unable to move either way, and was doomed to a terrible and horrible death, that of starvation. In a boy's mind, however, there is an extraordinary amount of elasticity and hope, and I began to think of all sorts of plans to escape my gloomy fate. In the first place, I required no food just at present, having had an excellent meal, and was therefore allowed time for reflection. My first thought was to try and move the mortar with my hand. Had I possessed a knife, something might have been done, but that useful instrument I had left in my coat pocket. I soon found that all efforts of this kind were vain and useless, and that all I could hope to do was to wriggle downwards. But though I jerked and struggled and strove to turn, it was all in vain. I could not move an inch one way or the other, and time flew rapidly. My early rising probably contributed to the fact that I felt sleepy, and gradually gave way to the sensation of drowsiness. I slept and awoke in darkness, ravenously hungry. Night had come, and still I could not move. I was tight bound, and did not succeed in changing my position an inch. I groaned aloud. Never since the days of my happy childhood, when it was a hardship to go from meal to meal without eating, had I really experienced hunger. The sensation was as novel as it was painful. I began now to lose my head, and to scream and cry out in my agony. Something appeared, startled by my noise. It was a harmless lizard, but it appeared to me a loathsome reptile. Again I made the old ruins resound with my cries, and finally so exhausted myself that I fainted. How long I lay in a kind of trance or sleep I cannot say, but when again I recovered consciousness it was day. How ill I felt, how hunger still gnawed at me, it would be hard to say. I was too weak to scream now, far too weak to struggle. Suddenly I was startled by a roar.
"Are you there, Henry?"
said the voice of my uncle.
"Are you there, my boy?"
I could only faintly respond, but I also made a desperate effort to turn. Some mortar fell. To this I owed my being discovered. When the search took place, it was easily seen that mortar and small pieces of stone had recently fallen from above. Hence my uncle's cry.
"Be calm,"
He cried.
"If we pull down the whole ruin, you shall be saved."
They were delicious words, but I had little hope. Soon, however, about a quarter of an hour later, I heard a voice above me at one of the upper fireplaces.
"Are you below or above?"
"Below," was my reply. In an instant a basket was lowered with milk, a biscuit, and an egg. My uncle was fearful to be too ready with his supply of food. I drank the milk first, for thirst had nearly deadened hunger. I then, much refreshed, ate my bread and hard egg. They were now at work at the wall. I could hear a pickaxe. Wishing to escape all danger from this terrible weapon, I made a desperate struggle, and the belt which surrounded my waist, and which had been hitched on a stone, gave way. I was free, and only escaped falling down by a rapid motion of my hands and knees. In 10 minutes more I was in my uncle's arms, after being 2 days and nights in that horrible prison. My occasional delirium prevented me from counting time. I was weeks recovering from that awful starvation adventure, and yet what was that to the hideous sufferings I now endured? After dreaming for some time, and thinking of this and other matters, I once more looked around me. We were still ascending with fearful rapidity. Every now and then the air appeared to check our respiration, as it does that of aeronauts when the ascension of the balloon is too rapid. But if they feel a degree of cold in proportion to the elevation they attain in the atmosphere, we experienced quite a contrary effect. The heat began to increase in a most threatening and exceptional manner. I cannot tell exactly the mean, but I think it must have reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit. What was the meaning of this extraordinary change in the temperature? As far as we had hitherto gone, facts had proved the theories of Davy and of Lidenbrock to be correct. Until now all the peculiar conditions of refractory rocks, of electricity, of magnetism, had modified the general laws of nature, and had created for us a moderate temperature, for the theory of the central fire remained in my eyes the only explainable one. Were we then going to reach a position in which these phenomena were to be carried out in all their rigor, and in which the heat would reduce the rocks to a state of fusion? Such was my not unnatural fear, and I did not conceal the fact from my uncle. My way of doing so might be cold and heartless, but I could not help it. If we are not drowned or smashed into pancakes, and if we do not die of starvation, we have the satisfaction of knowing that we must be burned alive. My uncle, in presence of this brusque attack, simply shrugged his shoulders, and resumed his reflections, whatever they might be. An hour passed away, and except that there was a slight increase in the temperature, no incident modified the situation. My uncle at last, of his own accord, broke silence.
"Well, Henry, my boy," he said in a cheerful way, "we must make up our minds."
"Make up our minds to what?" I asked in considerable surprise.
"Well, to something. We must at whatever risk recruit our physical strength. If we make the fatal mistake of husbanding our little remnant of food, we may probably prolong our wretched existence a few hours, but we shall remain weak to the end."
"Yes," I growled, "to the end. That, however, will not keep us long waiting."
"Well, only let a chance of safety present itself. Only allow that a moment of action be necessary. Where shall we find the means of action if we allow ourselves to be reduced to physical weakness by inanition?"
"When this piece of meat is devoured, uncle, what hope will there remain unto us?"
"None, my dear Henry, none. But will it do you any good to devour it with your eyes? You appear to me to reason like one without will or decision, like a being without energy."
"Then," cried I, exasperated to a degree which is scarcely to be explained, "you do not mean to tell me that you have not lost all hope?"
"Certainly not,"
replied the Professor with consummate coolness. "You mean to tell me, uncle, that we shall get out of this monstrous subterranean shaft?"
"While there is life, there is hope. I beg to assert, Henry, that as long as a man's heart beats, as long as a man's flesh quivers, I do not allow that a being gifted with thought and will can allow himself to despair." What a nerve! The man placed in a position like that we occupied
must have been very brave to speak like this. "Well," I cried, "what do you mean to do?"
"Eat what remains of the food we have in our hands. Let us swallow the last crumb. It will be, heaven willing, our last repast. Well, never mind. Instead of being exhausted skeletons, we shall be men."
"True," muttered I in a despairing tone. "Let us take our fill."
"We must," replied my uncle with a deep sigh, "call it what you will."
My uncle took a piece of the meat that remained, and some crusts of biscuit which had escaped the wreck. He divided the whole into three parts. Each had 1 pound of food to last him as long as he remained in the interior of the earth. Each now acted in accordance with his own private character. My uncle, the professor, ate greedily, but evidently without appetite, eating simply from some mechanical motion. I put the food inside my lips, and hungry as I was, chewed my morsel without pleasure and without satisfaction. Hans, the guide, just as if he had been eiderdown hunting, swallowed every mouthful as though it were a usual affair. He looked like a man equally prepared to enjoy superfluity or total want. Hans, in all probability, was no more used to starvation than ourselves, but his hardy Icelandic nature had prepared him for many sufferings. As long as he received his 3 rix every Saturday night, he was prepared for anything. The fact was, Hans never troubled himself about much except his money. He had undertaken to serve a certain man at so much per week, and no matter what evils befell his employer or himself, he never found fault or grumbled, so long as his wages were duly paid. Suddenly my uncle roused himself. He had seen a smile on the face of our guide. I could not make it out.
"What is the matter?"
said my uncle. "Schiedam," said the guide, producing a bottle of this precious fluid. We drank. My uncle and myself will own to our dying day that hence we derived strength to exist until the last bitter moment. That precious bottle of Hollands was in reality only half full, but under the circumstances it was nectar. It took some minutes for myself and my uncle to form a decided opinion on the subject. The worthy professor swallowed about half a pint, and did not seem able to drink any more.
"Förträfflig,"
said Hans, swallowing nearly all that was left.
"Excellent, very good,"
said my uncle, with as much gusto as if he had just left the steps of the club at Hamburg. I had begun to feel as if there had been one gleam of hope. Now all thought of the future vanished. We had consumed our last ounce of food, and it was 5 o'clock in the morning. End of chapter 41, read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 42 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 42. The Volcanic Shaft. Man's constitution is so peculiar that his health is purely a negative matter. No sooner is the rage of hunger appeased than it becomes difficult to comprehend the meaning of starvation. It is only when you suffer that you really understand. As to anyone who has not endured privation having any notion of the matter, it is simply absurd. With us, after a long fast, some mouthfuls of bread and meat, a little mouldy biscuit and salt beef triumphed over all our previous gloomy and saturnine thoughts. Nevertheless, after this repast, each gave way to his own reflections. I wondered what were those of Hans, the man of the extreme north, who was yet gifted with the fatalistic resignation of Oriental character. But the utmost stretch of the imagination would not allow me to realize the truth. As for my individual self, my thoughts had ceased to be anything but memories of the past, and were all connected with that upper world which I never should have left. I saw it all now: the beautiful house in the Königstrasse, my poor Gretchen, the good Martha, they all passed before my mind like visions of the past. Every time any of the lugubrious groanings which were to be distinguished in the hollows around fell upon my ears, I fancied I heard the distant murmur of the great cities above my head. As for my uncle, always thinking of his science, he examined the nature of the shaft by means of a torch. He closely examined the different strata one above the other, in order to recognize his situation by geological theory. This calculation, or rather this estimation, could by no means be anything but approximate. But a learned man, a philosopher, is nothing if not a philosopher, when he keeps his ideas calm and collected, and certainly the Professor possessed this quality to perfection. I heard him, as I sat in silence, murmuring words of geological science. As I understood his object and his meaning, I could not but interest myself despite my preoccupation in that terrible hour.
Eruptive granite, he said to himself. We are still in the primitive epoch. But we are going up, still going up. But who knows? Who knows?
Then he still hoped. He felt along the vertical sides of the shaft with his hand, and some few minutes later he would go on again in the following style.
This is gneiss. This is mica schist, siliceous mineral. Good again. This is the epoch of transition. At all events, we are close to them, and then.
What could the Professor mean? Could he by any conceivable means measure the thickness of the crust of the earth suspended above our heads? Did he possess any possible means of making any approximation to this calculation? No. The manometer was wanting, and no summary estimation could take the place of it. And yet, as we progressed, the temperature increased in the most extraordinary degree, and I began to feel as if I were bathed in a hot and burning atmosphere. Never before had I felt anything like it. I could only compare it to the hot vapor from an iron foundry, when the liquid iron is in a state of ebullition and runs over. By degrees, and one after the other, Hans, my uncle, and myself had taken off our coats and waistcoats. They were unbearable. Even the slightest garment was not only uncomfortable, but the cause of extreme suffering. "Are we ascending to a living fire?" I cried, when to my horror and astonishment the heat became greater than before.
No, no, said my uncle. It is simply impossible, quite impossible.
"And yet," said I, touching the side of the shaft with my naked hand, "this wall is literally burning." At this moment, feeling as I did that the sides of this extraordinary wall were red hot, I plunged my hands into the water to cool them. I drew them back with a cry of despair. "The water is boiling!" I cried. My uncle, the Professor, made no reply other than a gesture of rage and despair. Something very like the truth had probably struck his imagination, but I could take no share in either what was going on or in his speculations. An invincible dread had taken possession of my brain and soul. I could only look forward to an immediate catastrophe, such a catastrophe as not even the most vivid imagination could have thought of. An idea, at first vague and uncertain, was gradually being changed into certainty. I tremulously rejected it at first, but it forced itself upon me by degrees with extreme obstinacy. It was so terrible an idea that I scarcely dared to whisper it to myself, and yet all the while certain, as it were, involuntary observations determined my convictions. By the doubtful glare of the torch I could make out some singular changes in the granitic strata. A strange and terrible phenomenon was about to be produced, in which electricity played a part. Then this boiling water, this terrible and excessive heat? I determined as a last resource to examine the compass. The compass had gone mad. Yes, fully stark, staring mad. The needle jumped from pole to pole with sudden and surprising jerks, ran round, or, as it is said, boxed the compass, and then ran suddenly back again, as if it had the vertigo. I was aware that according to the best acknowledged theories, it was a received notion that the mineral crust of the globe is never and never has been in a state of complete repose. It is perpetually undergoing the modifications caused by the decomposition of internal matter, the agitation consequent on the flowing of extensive liquid currents, the excessive action of magnetism which tends to shake it incessantly, at a time when even the multitudinous beings on its surface do not suspect the seething process to be going on. Still, this phenomenon would not have alarmed me alone. It would not have aroused in my mind a terrible, an awful idea. But other facts could not allow my self-delusion to last. Terrible detonations, like heaven's artillery, began to multiply themselves with fearful intensity. I could only compare them with the noise made by hundreds of heavily laden chariots being madly driven over a stone pavement. It was a continuous roll of heavy thunder. And then the mad compass, shaken by the wild electric phenomena, confirmed me in my rapidly formed opinion. The mineral crust was about to burst, the heavy granite masses were about to rejoin, the fissure was about to close, the void was about to be filled up, and we poor atoms to be crushed in its awful embrace. "Uncle, uncle!" I cried, "we are wholly, irretrievably lost!"
What then, my young friend, is your new cause of terror and alarm? He said in his calmest manner. What fear you now?
What do I fear now? I cried in fierce and angry tones. Do you not see that the walls of the shaft are in motion? Do you not see that the solid granite masses are cracking? Do you not feel the terrible, torrid heat? Do you not observe the awful boiling water on which we float? Do you not remark this mad needle? Every sign and portent of an awful earthquake. My uncle coolly shook his head.
An earthquake?
He replied in the most calm and provoking tone. Yes.
My nephew, I tell you that you are utterly mistaken, he continued.
Can you not recognize all the well-known symptoms?
Of an earthquake? By no means. I am expecting something far more important.
My brain is strained beyond endurance. What do you mean? I cried.
An eruption, Harry.
An eruption? I gasped. We are then in the volcanic shaft of a crater in full action and vigor.
I have every reason to think so, said the professor in a smiling tone, and I beg to tell you that it is the most fortunate thing that could happen to us.
The most fortunate thing? Had my uncle really and truly gone mad? What did he mean by these awful words? What did he mean by this terrible calm, this solemn smile? What? Cried I, in the height of my exasperation. We are on the way to an eruption, are we? Fatality has cast us into a well of burning and boiling lava, of rocks on fire, of boiling water, in a word, filled with every kind of eruptive matter. We are about to be expelled, thrown up, vomited, spit out of the interior of the earth, in common with huge blocks of granite, with showers of cinders and scoria, in a wild whirlwind of flame, and you say the most fortunate thing which could happen to us.
Yes,
replied the Professor, looking at me calmly from under his spectacles.
"It is the only chance which remains to us of ever escaping from the interior of the earth to the light of day."
It is quite impossible that I can put on paper the thousand strange, wild thoughts which followed this extraordinary announcement. But my uncle was right, quite right, and never had he appeared to me so audacious and so convinced as when he looked me calmly in the face and spoke of the chances of an eruption, of our being cast upon Mother Earth once more through the gaping crater of a volcano. Nevertheless, while we were speaking, we were still ascending. We passed the whole night going up, or to speak more scientifically, in an ascensional motion. The fearful noise redoubled. I was ready to suffocate. I seriously believed that my last hours was approaching. And yet, so strange is imagination, all I thought of was some childish hypothesis or other. In such circumstances you do not choose your own thoughts, they overcome you. It was quite evident that we were being cast upwards by eruptive matter. Under the raft there was a mass of boiling water, and under this was a heavier mass of lava, and an aggregate of rocks, which, on reaching the summit of the water, would be dispersed in every direction. That we were inside the chimney of a volcano there could no longer be the shadow of a doubt. Nothing more terrible could be conceived. But on this occasion, instead of Sneffels, an old and extinct volcano, we were inside a mountain of fire in full activity. Several times I found myself asking what mountain was it, and on what part of the world we should be shot out, as if it were of any consequence. In the northern regions there could be no reasonable doubt about that. Before it went decidedly mad, the compass had never made the slightest mistake. From the Cape of Saknussemm we had been swept away to the northward many hundreds of leagues. Now the question was, were we once more under Iceland? Should we be belched forth on to the earth through the crater of Mount Hecla, or should we reappear through one of the other 7 fire funnels of the island? Taking in my mental vision a radius of 500 leagues to the westward, I could see under this parallel only the little known volcanoes of the northwest coast of America. To the east one only existed somewhere about the 80th degree of latitude, the Esk upon the island of Jan Mayen, not far from the frozen regions of Spitzbergen. It was not craters that were wanting, and many of them were big enough to vomit a whole army. All I wished to know was the particular one towards which we were making with such fearful velocity. I often think now of my folly, as if I should ever have expected to escape. Towards morning the ascending motion became greater and greater. If the degree of heat increased instead of decreasing as we approached the surface of the earth, it was simply because the causes were local and wholly due to volcanic influence. Our very style of locomotion left in my mind no doubt upon the subject. An enormous force, a force of several hundreds of atmospheres produced by the vapors accumulated and long compressed in the interior of the earth, was hoisting us upwards with irresistible power. But though we were approaching the light of day, to what fearful dangers were we about to be exposed? Instant death appeared the only fate which we could expect or contemplate. Soon a dim sepulchral light penetrated the vertical gallery, which became wider and wider. I could make out to the right and left long dark corridors like immense tunnels, from which awful and horrid vapors poured out. Tongues of fire, sparkling and crackling, appeared about to lick us up. The hour had come. "Look, Uncle, look!" I cried.
Well, what you see are the great sulphurous flames, nothing more common in connection with an eruption.
But if they lap us round, I angrily replied.
They will not lap us round, was his quiet and serene answer.
But it will be all the same in the end if they stifle us, I cried.
We shall not be stifled. The gallery is rapidly becoming wider and wider, and if it be necessary, we will presently leave the raft and take refuge in some fissure in the rock.
But the water which is continually ascending, I despairingly replied.
There is no longer any water, Harry, he answered, but a kind of lava paste, which is heaving us up in company with itself to the mouth of the crater.
In truth, the liquid column of water had wholly disappeared, to give place to dense masses of boiling, eruptive matter. The temperature was becoming utterly insupportable, and a thermometer exposed to this atmosphere would have marked between 189 and 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Perspiration rushed from every pore. But for the extraordinary rapidity of our ascent, we should have been stifled. Nevertheless, the Professor did not carry out his proposition of abandoning the raft, and he did quite wisely. Those few ill-joined beams offered, anyway, a solid surface, a support which elsewhere must have utterly failed us. Towards 8 o'clock in the morning, a new incident startled us. The ascensional movement suddenly ceased. The raft became still and motionless. "What is the matter now?" I said querulously, very much startled by this change.
A simple halt,
replied my uncle. "Is the eruption about to fail?" I asked.
I hope not.
Without making any reply, I rose. I tried to look around me. Perhaps the raft, checked by some projecting rock, opposed a momentary resistance to the eruptive mass. In this case, it was absolutely necessary to release it as quickly as possible. Nothing of the kind had occurred. The column of cinders, of scoria, of broken rocks and earth had wholly ceased to ascend. "I tell you, uncle, that the eruption has stopped," was my oracular decision.
Ah, said my uncle, you think so, my boy. You are wrong. Do not be in the least alarmed. This sudden moment of calm will not last long, be assured. It has already endured 5 minutes, and before we are many minutes older, we shall be continuing our journey to the mouth of the crater.
All the time he was speaking, the Professor continued to consult his chronometer, and he was probably right in his prognostics. Soon the raft resumed its motion in a very rapid and disorderly way, which lasted 2 minutes or thereabout, and then again it stopped as suddenly as before.
Good, said my uncle, observing the hour. In 10 we shall start again.
In 10 minutes?
Yes, precisely. We have to do with a volcano, the eruption of which is intermittent. We are compelled to breathe just as it does.
Nothing could be more true. At the exact minute he had indicated, we were again launched on high with extreme rapidity. Not to be cast off the raft, it was necessary to hold on to the beams. Then the hoist again ceased. Many times since have I thought of this singular phenomenon without being able to find for it any satisfactory explanation. Nevertheless, it appeared quite clear to me that we were not in the principal chimney of the volcano, but in an accessory conduit, where we felt the countershock of the great and principal tunnel filled by burning lava. It is impossible for me to say how many times this maneuver was repeated. All that I can remember is that on every ascensional motion we were hoisted up with ever increasing velocity, as if we had been launched from a huge projectile. During the sudden halts we were nearly stifled. During the moments of projection the hot air took away our breath. I thought for a moment of the voluptuous joy of suddenly finding myself in the Hyperborean regions with the cold 30 degrees below zero. My exalted imagination pictured to itself the vast snowy plains of the Arctic regions, and I was impatient to roll myself on the icy carpet of the North Pole. By degrees, my head, utterly overcome by a series of violent emotions, began to give way to hallucination. I was delirious. Had it not been for the powerful arms of Hans, the guide, I should have broken my head against the granite masses of the shaft. I have in consequence kept no account of what followed for many hours. I have a vague and confused remembrance of continual detonations, of the shaking of the huge granitic mass, and of the raft going round like a spinning top. It floated on the stream of hot lava, amidst a falling cloud of cinders. The huge flames roaring wrapped us around. A storm of wind, which appeared to be cast forth from an immense ventilator, roused up the interior fires of the earth. It was a hot, incandescent blast. At last I saw the figure of Hans, as if enveloped in the huge halo of burning blaze, and no other sense remained to me but that sinister dread which the condemned victim may be supposed to feel when led to the mouth of a cannon at the supreme moment when the shot is fired and his limbs are dispersed into empty space. End of chapter 42. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 43 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 43. Daylight at last. When I opened my eyes, I felt the hand of the guide clutching me firmly by the belt. With his other hand he supported my ankle. I was not grievously wounded, but bruised all over in the most remarkable manner. After a moment I looked around, and found that I was lying down on the slope of a mountain, not 2 yards from a yawning gulf into which I should have fallen, had I made the slightest false step. Hans had saved me from death, while I rolled insensible on the flanks of the crater.
"Where are we?"
dreamily asked my uncle, who literally appeared to be disgusted at having returned to earth. The eiderdown hunter simply shrugged his shoulders as a mark of total ignorance. "In Iceland?" said I, not positively, but interrogatively. "Nay," said Hans.
"How do you mean?" cried the Professor. "No, what are your reasons?"
"Hans is wrong," said I, rising. After all the innumerable surprises of this journey, a yet more singular one was reserved to us. I expected to see a cone covered by snow, by extensive and widespread glaciers, in the midst of the arid deserts of the extreme northern regions, beneath the full rays of a polar sky, beyond the highest latitudes. But, contrary to all our expectations, I, my uncle, and the Icelander were cast upon a slope of a mountain, calcined by the burning rays of a sun, which was literally baking us with its fires. I could not believe my eyes, but the actual heat which affected my body allowed me no chance of doubting. We came out of the crater half naked, and the radiant star from which we had asked nothing for 2 months was good enough to be prodigal to us of light and warmth, a light and warmth we could easily have dispensed with. When our eyes were accustomed to the light we had lost sight of so long, I used them to rectify the errors of my imagination. Whatever happened, we should have been at Spitzbergen, and I was in no humor to yield to anything but the most absolute proof. After some delay the Professor spoke.
He said in a hesitating kind of way. "It really does not look like Iceland."
"But supposing it were the island of Jan Mayen?" I ventured to observe.
"Not in the least, my boy. This is not one of the volcanoes of the north, with its hills of granite and its crown of snow." "Nevertheless " "Look, look, my boy," said the Professor, as dogmatically as usual. Right above our heads, at a great height, opened the crater of a volcano, from which escaped, from one quarter of an hour to the other, with a very loud explosion, a lofty jet of flame mingled with pumice stone, cinders, and lava. I could feel the convulsions of nature in the mountain, which breathed like a huge whale, throwing up from time to time fire and air through its enormous vents. Below, and floating along a slope of considerable angularity, the stream of eruptive matter spread away to a depth which did not give the volcano a height of 300 fathoms. Its base disappeared in a perfect forest of green trees, among which I perceived olives, fig trees, and vines loaded with rich grapes. Certainly, this was not the ordinary aspect of the Arctic regions. About that there could not be the slightest doubt. When the eye was satisfied at its glimpse of this verdant expanse, it fell upon the waters of a lovely sea or beautiful lake, which made of this enchanted land an island of not many leagues in extent. On the side of the rising sun was to be seen a little port, crowded with houses, and near which the boats and vessels of peculiar build were floating upon azure waves. Beyond, groups of islands rose above the liquid plain, so numerous and close together as to resemble a vast beehive. Towards the setting sun, some distant shores were to be made out on the edge of the horizon. Some presented the appearance of blue mountains of harmonious conformation. Upon others, much more distant, there appeared a prodigiously lofty cone, above the summit of which hung dark and heavy clouds. Towards the north, an immense expanse of water sparkled beneath the solar rays, occasionally allowing the extremity of a mast or the convexity of a sail bellying to the wind to be seen. The unexpected character of such a scene added a hundredfold to its marvelous beauties. "Where can we be?" I asked, speaking in a low and solemn voice. Hans shut his eyes with an air of indifference, and my uncle looked on without clearly understanding. "Whatever this mountain may be," he said at last, "I must confess it is rather warm. The explosions do not leave off, and I do not think it is worth while to have left the interior of a volcano and remain here to receive a huge piece of rock upon one's head. Let us carefully descend the mountain and discover the real state of the case. To confess the truth, I am dying of hunger and thirst." Decidedly, the Professor was no longer a truly reflective character. For myself, forgetting all my necessities, ignoring my fatigues and sufferings, I should have remained still for several hours longer, but it was necessary to follow my companions. The slope of the volcano was very steep and slippery. We slid over piles of ashes, avoiding the streams of hot lava, which glided about like fiery serpents. Still, while we were advancing, I spoke with extreme volubility, for my imagination was too full not to explode in words. "We are in Asia," I exclaimed. "We are on the coast of India, in the great Malay Islands, in the center of Oceania. We have crossed the one half of the globe to come out right at the antipodes of Europe." "But the compass!" exclaimed my uncle. "Explain that to me." "Yes, the compass," I said with considerable hesitation. "I grant that is a difficulty. According to it, we have always been going northward." "Then it lied." To say that it lied is rather a harsh word," was my answer. "Then we are at the North Pole?" "The pole? No. Well, I give it up," was my reply. The plain truth was that there was no explanation possible. I could make nothing of it. And all the while we were approaching this beautiful verdure,
Hunger and thirst tormented me fearfully. Happily, after 2 long hours' march, a beautiful country spread out before us, covered by olives, pomegranates, and vines, which appeared to belong to anybody and everybody. In any event, in the state of destitution into which we had fallen, we were not in a mood to ponder too scrupulously. What delight it was to press these delicious fruits to our lips, and to bite at grapes and pomegranates fresh from the vine! Not far off, near some fresh and mossy grass, under the delicious shade of some trees, I discovered a spring of fresh water, in which we voluptuously laved our faces, hands, and feet. While we were all giving way to the delights of new found pleasures, a little child appeared between two tufted olive trees. "Ah!" cried I, "an inhabitant of this happy country." The little fellow was poorly dressed, weak and suffering, and appeared terribly alarmed at our appearance. Half naked, with tangled, matted, and ragged beards, we did look supremely ill favored, and unless the country was a bandit land, we were not likely to alarm the inhabitants. Just as the boy was about to take to his heels, Hans ran after him and brought him back despite his cries and kicks. My uncle tried to look as gentle as possible, and then spoke in German.
"What is the name of this mountain, my friend?"
The child made no reply.
"Good," said my uncle with a very positive air of conviction. "We are not in Germany."
He then made the same demand in English, of which language he was an excellent scholar. The child shook its head and made no reply. I began to be considerably puzzled.
"Is he dumb?"
cried the Professor, who was rather proud of his polyglot knowledge of languages, and made the same demand in French. The boy only stared in his face.
"I must perforce try him in Italian," said my uncle with a shrug. "Dove noi siamo?"
"Yes, tell me where we are," I added impatiently and eagerly. Again the boy remained silent.
"My fine fellow, do you or do you not mean to speak?" cried my uncle, who began to get angry. He shook him and spoke another dialect of the Italian language. "Come si noma questa isola?" What is the name of this island? "Stromboli," replied the rickety little shepherd, dashing away from Hans and disappearing in the olive groves. We thought little enough about him. Stromboli! What effect on the imagination did these few words produce? We were in the center of the Mediterranean, amidst the eastern archipelago of mythological memory, in the ancient Strongylos, where Aeolus kept the wind, and the tempest chained up. And those blue mountains which rose towards the rising sun were the mountains of Calabria. And that mighty volcano which rose on the southern horizon was Etna, the fierce and celebrated Etna. Stromboli! Stromboli! I repeated to myself. My uncle played a regular accompaniment to my gestures and words. We were singing together like an ancient chorus. Ah, what a journey! What a marvelous and extraordinary journey! Here we had entered the earth by one volcano, and we had come out by another. And this other was situated more than 1200 leagues from Sneffels, from that drear country of Iceland, cast away on the confines of the earth. The wondrous changes of this expedition had transported us to the most harmonious and beautiful of earthly lands. We had abandoned the region of eternal snows for that of infinite verdure, and had left over our heads the gray fog of the icy regions to come back to the azure sky of Sicily. After a delicious repast of fruits and fresh water, we again continued our journey in order to reach the port of Stromboli. To say how we had reached the island would scarcely have been prudent. The superstitious character of the Italians would have been at work, and we should have been called demons vomited from the infernal regions.
It was therefore necessary to pass for humble and unfortunate shipwrecked travellers. It was certainly less striking and romantic, but it was decidedly safer. As we advanced I could hear my worthy uncle muttering to himself:
"But the compass! The compass most certainly marked north. This is a fact I cannot explain in any way."
"Well, the fact is," said I with an air of disdain, "we must not explain anything. It will be much more easy."
"I should like to see a professor of the Johanneum institution who is unable to explain a cosmic phenomenon. It would indeed be strange."
And speaking thus, my uncle, half naked, his leathern purse round his loins, and his spectacles upon his nose, became once more the terrible professor of mineralogy. An hour after leaving the Wood of Olives, we reached the fort of San Vicenza, where Hans demanded the price of his 13 weeks of service. My uncle paid him with very many warm shakes of the hand. At that moment, if he did not indeed quite share our natural emotion, he allowed his feelings so far to give way as to indulge in an extraordinary expression for him. With the tips of 2 fingers he gently pressed our hands and smiled. End of chapter 43. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 44 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 44. The Journey Ended. This is the final conclusion of a narrative which will be probably disbelieved even by people who are astonished at nothing. I am, however, armed at all points against human incredulity. We were kindly received by the Strombolite fishermen, who treated us as shipwrecked travelers. They gave us clothes and food. After a delay of 48 hours, on the 30th of September, a little vessel took us to Messina, where a few days of delightful and complete repose restored us to ourselves. On Friday, the 4th of October, we embarked in the Volturne, one of the postal packets of the Imperial Messageries of France, and 3 days later we landed at Marseilles, having no other care on our minds but that of our precious but erratic compass. This inexplicable circumstance tormented me terribly. On the 9th of October, in the evening, we reached Hamburg. What was the astonishment of Martha, what the joy of Gretchen! I will not attempt to define it. "Now then, Harry, that you really are a hero," she said, "there is no reason why you should ever leave me again." I looked at her. She was weeping tears of joy. I leave it to be imagined if the return of Professor Hardwigg made or did not make a sensation in Hamburg. Thanks to the indiscretion of Martha, the news of his departure for the interior of the earth had been spread over the whole world. No one would believe it, and when they saw him come back in safety, they believed it all the less. But the presence of Hans and many stray scraps of information by degrees modified public opinion. Then my uncle became a great man, and I the nephew of a great man, which, at all events, is something. Hamburg gave a festival in our honor. A public meeting of the Johanneum institution was held, at which the professor related the whole story of his adventures, omitting only the facts in connection with the compass. That same day he deposited in the archives of the town the document he had found written by Saknussemm, and he expressed his great regret that circumstances stronger than his will did not allow him to follow the Icelandic traveler's track into the very center of the earth. He was modest in his glory, but his reputation only increased. So much honor necessarily created for him many envious enemies. Of course they existed, and as his theories, supported by certain facts, contradicted the system of science upon the question of central heat, he maintained his own views both with pen and speech against the learned of every country. Although I still believe in the theory of central heat, I confess that certain circumstances, hitherto very ill defined, may modify the laws of such natural phenomena. At the moment when these questions were being discussed with interest, my uncle received a rude shock, one that he felt very much. Hans, despite everything he could say to the contrary, quitted Hamburg. The man to whom we owed so much would not allow us to pay our deep debt of gratitude. He was taken with nostalgia, a love for his Icelandic home. "Farewell," said he one day, and with this one short word of adieu he started for Reykjavik, which he soon reached in safety. We were deeply attached to our brave eider duck hunter. His absence will never cause him to be forgotten by those whose lives he saved, and I hope at some not distant day to see him again. To conclude, I may say that our journey into the interior of the earth created an enormous sensation throughout the civilized world. It was translated and printed in many languages. All the leading journals published extracts from it, which were commentated, discussed, attacked, and supported with equal animation by those who believed in its episodes and by those who were utterly incredulous. Wonderful! My uncle enjoyed during his lifetime all the glory he deserved, and he was even offered a large sum of money by Mr. Barnum to exhibit himself in the United States, while I am credibly informed by a traveler that he is to be seen in waxwork at Madame Tussaud's. But one care preyed upon his mind, a care which rendered him very unhappy. One fact remained inexplicable, that of the compass. For a learned man to be baffled by such an inexplicable phenomenon was very aggravating. But Heaven was merciful, and in the end my uncle was happy. One day, while he put some minerals belonging to his collection in order, I fell upon the famous compass and examined it keenly. For 6 months it had lain unnoticed and untouched. I looked at it with curiosity, which soon became surprise. I gave a loud cry. The professor, who was at hand, soon joined me.
"What is the matter?"
he cried. "The compass."
"What then?"
"Why, its needle points to the south and not to the north."
"My dear boy, you must be dreaming."
"I'm not dreaming. See, the poles are changed."
"Changed?"
My uncle put on his spectacles, examined the instrument, and leaped with joy, shaking the whole house. A clear light fell upon our minds.
"Here it is," he
cried as soon as he had recovered the use of his speech.
"After we had once passed Cape Saknussemm, the needle of this compass pointed to the southward instead of the northward."
"Evidently."
"Our error is now easily explained. But to what phenomenon do we owe this alteration in the needle?"
"Nothing more simple."
"Explain yourself, my boy. I am on thorns."
"During the storm upon the Central Sea, the ball of fire which made a magnet of the iron in our raft turned our compass topsy turvy."
"Ha!"
cried the professor with a loud and ringing laugh.
"It was a trick of that inexplicable electricity."
From that hour my uncle was the happiest of learned men, and I the happiest of ordinary mortals. For my pretty Virland girl, abdicating her position as ward, took her place in the house in the Königstrasse in the double quality of niece and wife. We need scarcely mention that her uncle was the illustrious Professor Hartwig, corresponding member of all the scientific, geographical, mineralogical, and geological societies of the 5 parts of the globe. End of the Voyage Extraordinaire. End of chapter 44, read by Lars Rolander. And thereby also the end of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Thank you for listening. We hope you have enjoyed the book and wish you welcome again to more audiobooks at LibriVox.org.